Hello everyone. If you like this audiobook and want to listen to more, please consider subscribing. And if you like this video, like it as well, that it enjoy.
The second life of the rogue prince. Darkness. It was absolute, a void that swallowed thought and time alike. For a fleeting eternity, there was nothing, no self, no memory, just a hollow silence. Then, the world exploded. Initialization complete. Synchronizing soul, 100%. Pain, sharp and jagged, tore through his senses. A sudden, violent rush of air flooded lungs that felt far too small, far too weak. "I can't breathe," he tried to gasp, but the effort manifested as a high-pitched, piercing wail. A strong cry. The prince has a powerful voice. Look at the silver, it's as pale as moonlight. Light stabbed at his eyes, blurry and blinding. Large, distorted shapes moved in the periphery. The muffled sounds began to sharpen into a language he recognized but shouldn't. Prince. The word sent a ripple of cognitive dissonance through his mind. Warmth enveloped him as he was lifted by steady hands and wrapped in coarse, heavy fabric. He was moved through the air and settled into a pair of trembling, exhausted arms. "Let me see him," a woman's voice whispered, thick with fatigue and love. "My son." He forced his heavy eyelids open. The woman before him was breathtaking, even in her disheveled state. Sweet-slicked silver-gold hair clung to her forehead, and her mismatched eyes, right violet and left green, both deep, shimmering pools of amethyst, looked at him with a tenderness that made his new heart ache. Suddenly, his brain felt like it was being fed into a grinder. Memories. Two distinct lives collided. One was a world of concrete and glass. High-speed internet, exhausting 9 to 5 shifts. The flicker of a screen displaying a world of ice and fire. The other was a world of blood and ash. The roar of a dragon named Caraxes. The weight of Dark Sister in his hand. The crushing political weight of a crown he never wore. "What is happening?" A name was spoken, cutting through the haze like a Valyrian steel blade. "Prince Daemon Targaryen." The words were a death sentence. Daemon Targaryen. He froze. He knew that name. He knew the history. He knew the fire and the blood that awaited this house. He was in the Red Keep. The year was 81 AC. The old king, Jaehaerys, sat upon the Iron Throne at the height of his power. But Daemon knew what lay ahead. The Great Council, the dance, the extinction of the dragons, the slow, pathetic decline of the greatest dynasty to ever grace the earth. "If I follow the script, I die in a lake, taking my nephew with me while the world burns." His tiny, soft fists clenched. "No, I've been given a second chance. I won't be a pawn of fate or a slave to my own impulsive blood. I will save this house. I will save the dragons." Just as his resolve hardened, a cold, mechanical pulse thrummed behind his eyes. "Welcome, heir of dragons. Magic Tower. Initialized." The room vanished. He wasn't an infant anymore. He stood in a colossal hall carved from obsidian and shadow. Above him, a tower of impossible proportions pierced the dark, its floors glowing with ancient, blood-red runes. The air here tasted of ozone and ancient secrets. Floor 1. Locked. Status. Mana awakening. A voice, deeper than the roots of the world, echoed through the hall. "Begin your ascent." The vision snapped. He was back in the warm, herb-scented room of the Red Keep. His mother, Alyssa, was humming a soft Valyrian lullaby. But the tower remained. He could feel it, a dormant volcano of power sitting at the base of his soul. In a world where magic was a fading ember, he had just been handed an inferno. A slow, toothless smile spread across the infant's face. The rogue prince was back. And this time, the gods would be the ones to tremble. The exhaustion of a newborn's body was a physical weight, pulling at his consciousness. But the mind of the man once known as, who struggled against the fog. The memories of his previous life were like a library caught in a storm. He could see the covers of the books, earth, history, engineering, fire and blood, but the pages were blurring. He needed to anchor himself. "Focus," he told himself. "I am Daemon Targaryen, son of Balon, grandson of Jaehaerys. It is 82 AC. He felt the rhythmic thrum of his mother's heartbeat. Princess Alyssa Targaryen. In the books, she was a woman of fire and laughter. In this life, she was his shield. But his attention was drawn elsewhere. Deep within his mind, the magic tower pulsed. It wasn't just a vision, it was a tether. Status window. Name: Daemon Targaryen. Age: 0 years, newborn. Title: The Rogue Prince, locked heir of the tower. Current floor: 1. The Hall of Awakening. Mana core: dormant, awakening, 0.01%. A system, his mental voice echoed with a mix of shock and grim satisfaction. In a world of low magic and dying dragons, I have a literal tower of sorcery in my head. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Targaryens claimed to be closer to gods than men because they flew, but they had lost the true sorcery of old Valyria long ago. They were just aristocrats with oversized lizards. If I can climb this tower, I won't just be a dragon rider. I'll be a sorcerer lord. Suddenly, the door to the birthing chamber creaked open. Heavy boots thudded against the stone floor. "Let me see him," a booming, joyous voice commanded. Daemon strained his neck, his weak infant muscles protesting. A man leaned into his field of vision. He had the classic Valyrian look with strong jaw, eyes like amethysts, and a mane of silver hair that caught the torchlight. Daemon Targaryen, the Spring Prince, the man who should have been king. He has the look of a true dragon, Alyssa, Daemon whispered, reaching out a calloused finger to touch Daemon's tiny hand. As their skin met, the magic tower reacted. Alert. Passive mana siphoning initiated. Source: high-quality draconic bloodline, Daemon Targaryen. Progress: 0.02%. 0.03%. Reward for reaching floor 1, 1%. Dragon tongue. Daemon felt a warm spark travel from his father into his own chest. It wasn't enough to hurt Balon, but for a newborn, it felt like drinking liquid sunlight. So that's how it works, Daemon realized. I can grow by being near the dragons. Balon's laughter boomed through the stone chamber, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. He held Daemon aloft as if presenting a trophy to the gods of old Valyria themselves. "Look at him, Alyssa. He doesn't flinch. Most babes squint at the light, but this one, he looks like he's judging the very air he breathes." Daemon didn't pull away. Instead, he focused on the strange, ethereal pull in his chest. Alert. Mana siphoning in progress. Current progress: 0.08%. My father is a powerhouse, Daemon thought, his infant mind processing the data with cold efficiency. But he isn't the one I need to see most. His mind drifted to the histories he'd read in his past life. In 81 AC, the hierarchy of House Targaryen was absolute. His uncle, Prince Aemon, was the Prince of Dragonstone and the Rider of Caraxes. The Blood Worm. In the original timeline, Daemon wouldn't claim that dragon until after Aemon's death in 92 AC. That was over a decade away. Too long. If he was going to prevent the dance, he couldn't wait until he was a man grown to start gathering his pieces. "Peace, Balon," Alyssa murmured, reaching out. Her voice was thin, but her eyes were sharp. "Bring him back. He is a prince, not a tourney prize." Balon chuckled and lowered Daemon back into the warmth of his mother's arms. As the physical contact with his father broke, the siphoning alert faded into the background. Mana awakening: 0.10%. System note: siphoning efficiency decreases with physical distance. Direct contact with dragon-blooded individuals or Valyrian artifacts is recommended for rapid growth. Artifacts. Daemon's eyes narrowed. Blackfire, Dark Sister, the King's Crown. The Red Keep was a goldmine of ancient power, but as a newborn, he was effectively a prisoner of his own nursery. He couldn't exactly crawl to the king's chambers and start licking the ancestral swords for mana. "I need a plan. I need to reach 1.0% to get dragon tongue. If I can understand the dragons before I can even speak the common tongue, I'll have a lead that no one in the history of this world has ever possessed." "He's gone quiet again," Balon noted, a hint of awe in his voice. "I'll go tell the king. And Aemon, my brother will want to see his new nephew, though he might be jealous that my sons are coming so thick and fast." Aemon. Daemon felt a spark of interest. If Aemon came to visit, he might bring the scent of Caraxes with him. Or better yet, the Prince of Dragonstone might be wearing a piece of Valyrian jewelry. As Balon strode out of the room, his heavy boots echoing like drums, Alyssa looked down at her son. She brushed a strand of silver hair from his forehead. "You have a fire in you, Daemon," she whispered, her voice dropping to a level only he could hear. "I can feel it. Don't let them put it out." Daemon closed his eyes, pretending to drift into a newborn slumber. But inside, he was already standing before the massive obsidian gates of the magic tower. The runes on the first floor were beginning to glow with a faint, rhythmic pulse. "I won't just be a rogue prince," he promised the darkness. "I will be the architect of the Dragon's Peak." Floor 1 task. The first step. Current progress: 0.12%. Estimated time to 1.0% at current siphoning rate, 14 days. As Balon left the room, the silence of the birthing chamber was filled only by the crackle of the hearth and Alyssa's steady breathing. Daemon felt the shift immediately. Now that his father, a man whose presence was like a roaring bonfire, was gone, he could sense the subtler, more intricate heat coming from the woman holding him. Princess Alyssa Targaryen. She wasn't just his mother. She was the rider of Meleys, the Red Queen. One of the swiftest and most formidable dragons in the Dragon Pit. Alert. Passive mana siphoning resumed. Source. High-quality draconic bloodline, Alyssa Targaryen. Affinity detected. Fire, speed. Progress. 0.13%. 0.14%. The energy coming from Alyssa was different from Balon's. Where his father felt like a steady, heavy hammer of power, his mother felt like a flickering, razor-sharp flame. It was more refined, more active. I forgot, Daemon thought, his tiny heart racing. In this era, the women of House Targaryen are just as potent as the men. Alyssa doesn't just ride a dragon, she lives for the sky. He pressed his small face against her chest, drawing in the scent of smoke and expensive oils that clung to her skin. To the maesters, he looked like a hungry babe seeking comfort. In reality, he was a starving man at a banquet of ancient energy. Mana awakening. 0.20%. Siphoning efficiency increased. Note. Genetic proximity and Dragon Rider status provide a 2x multiplier to mana absorption. At this rate, I won't need 14 days, Daemon realized. If I stay glued to Alyssa, I can hit the 1.0% milestone within the week. Alyssa looked down, a tired but fierce grin spreading across her face. She felt the way her son clung to her, the strength in his tiny fingers. "You're a greedy little dragon, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice vibrating through his very bones. "Good. In this house, you must be greedy. You must take what is yours, or the world will bleed you dry." She shifted him, her violet eyes burning with a sudden, wild light. "As soon as I can walk, Daemon, I'll take you to the pit. I'll show you Meleys. We'll see if the Red Queen likes the scent of my Seconborn." Daemon's mind whirred. Meleys. The Red Queen was legendary for her speed. If he could siphon mana directly from a living dragon while being held by its rider, the tower wouldn't just awaken. It would erupt. The dance was a tragedy of lost potential. Daemon mused as he felt the first true threads of mana beginning to coil in his gut, forming the foundation of his mana core. The Targaryens had the keys to the heavens and used them to burn each other's gardens. I will take those keys. I will turn the tower into a fortress that even the doom of Valyria couldn't shake. Outside the window, a distant, earth-shaking roar echoed across King's Landing. It was a dragon's cry, likely Caraxes or Vagar, sensing the birth of a new bloodlink. Daemon didn't flinch, he simply tightened his grip on his mother's gown. Progress update. Mana awakening. 0.25%. Estimated time to floor 1 breakthrough, 4 days. 4 days until I can speak the language of the gods, Daemon thought, a cold, predatory satisfaction settling over him. Watch out, Westeros. The Rogue Prince has a head start. 3 comments 0 vote. The Dragon's Gaze. The Red Keep was never truly silent. To the servants, it was the sound of rushing footsteps, to the guards, the clatter of steel. But to the infant Prince Daemon Targaryen, the castle hummed with a different frequency entirely. He lay in his ornate cradle, draped in fine Myrish silks. Outwardly, he was a placid royal babe. Inwardly, his mind was a storm of data. The nursery was bathed in the amber glow of sunset. The scent of lavender and old parchment drifted through the air as a figure leaned over the cradle. It wasn't a wet nurse or a septa, but Queen Alysanne herself. The good queen was known for her wisdom and her love for the small folk, but here, she was simply a grandmother. She began to hum a low, haunting melody, a lullaby in High Valyrian that had been passed down from the days before the doom. Drakari Pykiros, purely merely, as the ancient words left her lips, the magic tower in Daemon's mind began to vibrate. Alert. Ancestral resonance detected. Source. Queen Alysanne, Rider of Silverwing. Effect. Mana stabilization in progress. Mana awakening. 0.45%. Her voice, it's not just music, Daemon realized, his tiny ears straining to catch every syllable. She's weaving intent into the sound. This is the old magic they say the Targaryens lost. He watched her through half-closed eyes. Alysanne smiled, her silver hair shimmering like a halo. She saw him watching and slowed her song, her violet eyes twinkling with a strange recognition. You hear it, don't you, little dragon? She whispered, stroking his cheek. The song of the fires that never go out. The heavy oak doors creaked open, admitting a gust of energetic air. Is he awake? Grandmother, is he awake yet? A boy of 5 years burst in, his silver hair a mess and his face flushed from running. Viserys Targaryen, the future king of the 7 kingdoms, looked down at Daemon with wide, curious eyes. To Daemon, Viserys felt soft, a warm, gentle glow, but lacking the sharp edge of a warrior or a sorcerer. Trailing behind him with much more poise was a girl of 7. Rhaenys Targaryen. Even at this age, the daughter of Prince Aemon carried herself with a regal sharpness. Her black hair inherited from her Baratheon mother was the only thing that set her apart from the sea of Targaryen silver. Detection. Rhaenys Targaryen unbonded. Viserys Targaryen unbonded. He's so small, Viserys whispered, reaching out to poke Daemon's cheek. Does he even know how to roar? Rhaenys stood beside him, her arms crossed. He's a Targaryen, Viserys. The roar is in the blood, not the lungs. She looked at Daemon with an analytical gaze that made the infant's soul chill. She was siphoning the same royal authority she would one day be denied. A man stepped inside, radiating a presence so fierce it felt like standing too close to an open furnace. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried the effortless grace of a predator. Prince Aemon Targaryen, the heir to the Iron Throne and the rider of the Blood Worm. Alert. Massive draconic mana detected. Source. Prince Aemon bonded, Caraxes. Synchronization rate. High. Daemon's tiny heart hammered against his ribs. It wasn't fear, it was hunger. The tower inside his soul began to groan, its obsidian foundations vibrating as it sensed the sheer density of the mana Aemon carried. It was the scent of the sky, the tang of sulfur, and the raw, ancient power of old Valyria. Mother, Aemon greeted the queen with a nod before leaning over the cradle. Father, Rhaenys brightened, moving to his side. Aemon placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder before leaning over the cradle. As he reached down to ruffle Daemon's hair, the tower screamed in triumph. The stolen energy flooded Daemon's core. Siphoning critical hit, mana awakening. 0.52% right pointing arrow 0.61%. Incredible, Daemon thought, fighting the urge to gasp as the stolen energy flooded his core. The bond between a rider and a dragon isn't just symbolic. Their souls are fused. Aemon is a walking conduit for Caraxes. The Great Hall of the Red Keep was a cavern of shadow and light, designed specifically to make men feel small. High above, the vaulted ceilings were lost in the gloom, while the afternoon sun bled through the narrow, arched windows in long, dusty shafts of crimson. As the heavy oak doors swung open, the scent hit him with a cloying, suffocating mixture of expensive Myrish oils, stale incense, and the underlying metallic tang of the Iron Throne itself. Daemon felt the steady rhythm of Baelin's stride as his father carried him toward the center of the hall. To anyone else, the court was a sea of faces. To Daemon's awakening mana sense, it was a chaotic whirlpool of colors and intentions. On the left stood the Lords of the Reach, led by the Hightowers in their silks of silver and smoke gray. They smelled of old books and hidden ambition, their eyes tracing the lines of Daemon's face as if calculating his future worth in gold. On the right were the Lords of the West, the Lannisters shining in crimson and gold, their pride radiating off them like heat. Behind them stood the minor lords, the vipers, the sycophants, and the power-hungry. All leaning forward to catch a glimpse of the newest prince of the blood. The air was thick with the silent judgment of 1,000 noble houses. Every rustle of a gown and every clink of a chain-mail link felt amplified in the oppressive silence. Then, his gaze moved to the end of the hall. There it was, the Iron Throne. It was a monstrous thing, an asymmetrical, jagged mountain of melted, twisted swords. It wasn't a seat for a man, it was a monument to conquest. It looked sharp enough to draw blood from the very air around it. Perched upon it was King Jaehaerys I. The old king looked every bit the legend. His long, silver-white beard was neatly combed, falling over robes of black velvet. His crown of yellow gold, set with 7 different colored gemstones, sat heavy upon a brow that was deeply lined with the burdens of a peaceful reign. Beside him stood Queen Alysanne. Though shorter than the king, her presence was no less formidable. Her silver hair was pinned back with a simple circlet, and her eyes were a clear, piercing violet which seemed to look not at Daemon's physical form, but at the soul beneath the skin. Balon stopped at the foot of the throne and lifted Daemon high. Your Grace, Balin's voice rang out, steady and proud. I present to you my second son, Prince Daemon of House Targaryen. The silence that followed was absolute. A normal infant would have been terrified. The thousand eyes, the sharp edges of the throne, the weight of the royal presence, it was designed to break the spirit. But Daemon remained unnervingly still. He didn't squirm. He didn't reach for his father's beard. Instead, he tilted his head back and stared directly into the eyes of Jaehaerys. So this is the conciliator, Daemon thought, his infant mind cold and analytical. The man who thinks he has tamed the world with laws and roads. He built a masterpiece of a kingdom, but he forgot that dragons weren't meant to be caged by peace. The king leaned forward, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the sword hilts of the throne. He didn't see a helpless babe. He saw a mirror. "Look at the boy," a lord whispered from the shadows. "He does not cry. He does not even blink. It is as if he is weighing the king's very soul." The murmurs rippled through the hall like a wind through tall grass. The lords of Westeros looked at the infant and felt a strange, primal shiver. There was something wrong with the boy's stillness, something ancient and predatory. "He has the gaze of a man grown," Jaehaerys finally spoke, his voice cracking like a whip through the hall. He turned his gaze to Balon, his expression grim. "There is a stillness in this one, Balon. A coldness. See that he is tempered well, or he may become a fire that cannot be quenched. A dragon who burns the world simply to see it glow." Beside the king, Queen Alysanne stepped closer, her eyes softening but her hand tightening on her husband's arm. She felt it too, the faint, rhythmic pulse of the magic tower beginning to resonate with the ancient steel of the throne. Alert. Proximity to the Iron Throne, massive Valyrian steel cluster detected. Passive siphoning, extreme, mana awakening, 0.72%, 0.75%. Daemon felt the surge of power, bitter, cold, and tasting of 1,000 conquered enemies. He didn't turn away, he simply watched the king, a tiny, ghost-like smile threatening to touch his lips. "The fire is already lit, grandfather," Daemon thought. "And this time, it won't just be the dragons that burn." Suddenly, the massive stained glass windows of the great hall rattled. "ROOOOOOOARRRRR." The sound was a physical blow. It was a scream of primal dominance that shook the very foundations of Aegon's high hill. Outside, a shadow swept over the castle, turning day into a brief, terrifying twilight. Caraxes. The blood worm was circling above, his long, serpentine neck arching as he shrieked at the stone walls. He had sensed something, a new spark, a resonance that shouldn't exist in a 2-day-old human. Inside Daemon's mind, the magic tower erupted in a pillar of crimson light. Mana awakening, 0.80%. The sound wasn't just noise to Daemon anymore. It was a vibration in his marrow. He heard a whisper, not in words, but in a raw, emotional tectonic shift. Kin, fire, wake. The sensation was so intense that Daemon's tiny lip curled into a smile, an expression that looked chillingly predatory on an infant's face. That night, the Red Keep was quiet, but the air remained charged. Daemon retreated into his inner world, standing once more before the great obsidian gate of Floor 1. The runes were no longer just glowing, they were bleeding light. Floor 1 progress. 0.98%. Condition detected. Proximity to Dragon Soul, Caraxes, Melis, Vagar. Bonus reward available. Genetic memory unlock. The tower isn't just a battery, Daemon realized, his phantom hands touching the cold stone of the gate. It's an archive. It's analyzing the dragons. It's learning how they breathe, how they fly, how they burn. In the solar nearby, he could hear his mother's boisterous laughter. Princess Alyssa was drinking wine with Balon, her voice full of fire. He didn't flinch at Caraxes' roar. She shouted, "Did you see?" My little Daemon smiled. "When he's strong enough, a few more moons, then I'm taking him to the pit. I'll set him right between Melis' horns. Let's see if the Red Queen recognizes her master." Balon laughed, but Daemon wasn't listening to the conversation anymore. He was listening to the sound of the gate cracking open. Mana awakening. 1.00%. Floor 1, ready to unlock. Daemon closed his eyes in his cradle, the silver hair framing a face that was no longer just a child's. The dragon pit, he thought, as the first gate of the tower swung wide, revealing a library of glowing scrolls within. That's where the real game begins. 8 comments, 0 vote. The little flame. The sun had barely crested the Blackwater Bay, painting the towers of the Red Keep in bruised purples and burnt oranges, when the peace of the royal solar was shattered. The heavy doors didn't just open, they were kicked wide. Princess Alyssa Targaryen marched in, still smelling of leather and the ozone of the high atmosphere. Her hair was wind-whipped, her riding leathers dusty, and her eyes danced with a manic, infectious energy. "Today is the day," she declared, her laughter echoing off the stone vaults. She didn't wait for a greeting. She swept toward the cradle and scooped Daemon up in a single, fluid motion. To a normal infant, the sudden movement would have been terrifying, but Daemon merely adjusted his weight, his violet eyes locking onto hers with sharp curiosity. Balon the Brave looked up from a map of the stepstones, rubbing his temples. A long sigh escaped him. "Alyssa, tell me you aren't thinking what I think you're thinking. You cannot bring a newborn to the dragon pit." Alyssa smirked, tucking Daemon under her arm with the effortless grace of a dragon rider. "He is a dragon, Balon. It's time he met his kin. If he's to rule the skies, he shouldn't be afraid of a little sulfur." "He is a newborn." Balon stood, his voice caught between amusement and genuine concern. "The dragon pit is no place for a babe. The heat, the fumes, the guards will have a collective heart attack." "Then let them die of it," Alyssa shot back, already halfway to the door. "He is a dragon, Balon. It's time he met his kin." The servants in the hallway scrambled out of the way, their faces pale with panic. A princess of the realm was sprinting toward the stables with a royal prince tucked under her arm. It was a maester's nightmare and a bard's dream. Daemon, however, wasn't crying. His violet eyes were wide, tracking the shift in the air. New location detected. Dragon Pit, Hill of Rainies. Status: Dragon Concentration Zone. Mana density: extremely high. This isn't just a stable, Daemon thought as the massive dome loomed over them. This is a nuclear reactor for the soul. The air within the dragon pit was a living thing, heavy, stagnant, and scorched. It felt less like a building and more like the interior of a dormant volcano that was slowly waking up. The dragon pit was a colossal, domed structure of stone and iron, a monument to the Targaryens' paradoxical desire to house their gods in a cage. The entrance was a yawning maw of shadow, leading into a labyrinth of descending tunnels carved deep into the Hill of Rainies. As they moved deeper, the walls themselves seemed to sweat a thick, black moisture that smelled of ancient soot. The ground was littered with fragments of shed scales, sharp as obsidian shards, and the charred remains of mountain goats. The deeper chambers were vast enough to hold a cathedral, yet they felt cramped by the sheer presence of the beasts within. The Dragonkeepers were a strange, ascetic order that Daemon observed with a cold, analytical eye. Clad in suits of blackened scales that mimicked the dragons they served, they moved through the gloom like ghosts. They were men who had traded their humanity for the proximity to fire. Their faces were often scarred by heat, their eyebrows singed away, and they spoke in a guttural version of High Valyrian that sounded more like a growl than a language. They carried long, hooked staffs of weirwood and iron, instruments designed not to harm the dragons, but to guide them, which was a futile gesture against creatures that could melt stone with a breath. As Alyssa stepped forward, the magic tower flared to life, its internal sensors sweeping the massive heat signatures before them. System data. Draconic entity detected. Name: Melis. Epithet: the Red Queen. Classification: high-tier adult dragon. Mana core signature: molten ruby, fire, speed affinity. Condition: bonded rider, Alyssa Targaryen. Danger level: calamitous. Current status: greater than curiosity, 85%. Blood resonance: 100% blood of the dragon detected. Tower interaction: decoding primal intent. Success. Deep in the cavernous dark, the sounds of shifting tons of muscle and the scraping of claws against stone echoed like thunder. Alert: passive siphoning multiplier, X7. Mana awakening: 1.03% right pointing arrow 1.21%. Daemon could feel them, not as animals, but as massive signatures of sentient heat. They were ancient, violent, and as they sensed his approach, they grew intensely curious. They reached the lower pens, where a mountain of molten rubies lay coiled. Melis, the Red Queen, lifted her head. Her golden eyes, slid with vertical pupils, locked onto the tiny bundle in Alyssa's arms. "Princess, step back," the Dragonkeepers shouted, their hooks trembling. "The Queen is restless today." Alyssa didn't flinch. She stepped closer. Melis let out a huff of hot steam that ruffled Daemon's silver hair, then slowly, impossibly, lowered her massive snout until it was inches from his face. "See," Alyssa laughed, her voice echoing in the chamber. "She knows her blood." But Daemon felt something more. The magic tower in his mind began to whirl, its obsidian gears grinding as it decoded the rhythmic pulses of the dragon's presence. New ability unlocked. Draconic resonance passive. He didn't hear words. He felt gravity. A heavy, Burning emotion flooded his mind: fire, blood, kin. Inside the darkness of his soul, the first obsidian gate didn't just open, it shattered. Floor 1 unlocked. Rewards. Skill. Dragon Tongue incomplete. Skill. Mana Sense. Feature. Valyrian Genetic Archive. A massive, circular library materialized within the tower. Thousands of scrolls, glowing with a faint violet light, lined the walls. These weren't just stories, they were the blueprints of a lost civilization. Dragon biology, soul-binding rituals, the geometry of fire, everything the Targaryens had forgotten was stored here. The tower isn't just giving me power, Daemon realized, a chill running through his infant form. It's rebuilding Valyria inside my head. Suddenly, the entire pit shook. A low, tectonic rumble started deep in the earth. From the deepest shadows, emerged a shape that made Melis look like a hatchling. Vagar, one of last two of the conquest generation. A living fortress of bronze and green, she was one of the two remaining titans who had seen the fields of the Reach burn alongside the Black Dread. Even Alyssa went still, her breath catching in her throat. The Dragonkeepers fell back in genuine terror. The ancient she-dragon leaned down, her breath a Galaforce wind. She sniffed Daemon, her ancient mind brushing against his. Ancient dragon detected. Mana surge. Mana awakening. 1.21% right pointing arrow 1.63%. In the silence of the pit, a voice that sounded like grinding stones echoed in Daemon's mind: little flame. As Balon stands there holding Daemon, the proximity to Vagar's bonded rider creates a feedback loop that the magic tower can barely contain. Ancient entity detected. Name: Vagar. Epithet: the hoary old bitch. Classification: Ancient Elder Dragon, Conquest Generation. Mana Core Signature: Emerald Abyss, Fire, Earth Affinity. Condition: Bonded Rider, Balon Targaryen. Danger Level: World Ending. Rider Link Analysis: Direct Conduit. Since Balon is holding the user, the tower is siphoning Vagar's ancient mana through the father-son bond. Mana Quality: Pure Conquest-era Essence. Siphoning rate remains at 12x due to the strength of Balon's bond. Risk Factor: Balon's sheer vitality acts as a filter, reducing the soul burn risk from 0.5% to 0.01%. The Shadow of the Conquerors. The dragon pit didn't just shake, it seemed to exhale. From the deepest, darkest archway, a bay designed for the dragons of Aegon's day, the great hoary bitch stirred. Vagar's head alone was the size of a carriage. Her scales were the color of deep-sea algae and weathered bronze, scarred by 100 battles and thick with the dust of decades. As she exhaled, a cloud of hot, dry air blasted through the cavern, carrying the scent of 1,000 years of sun-baked earth. She didn't just look at Daemon, she weighed him. Because she was bonded to Balon, she felt his pride, but through that link, she also felt the anomaly that was Daemon's soul. Alert: Ancient Resonance detected. Vagar is attempting to scan the user's soul core. Tower Defense active. Balon laughed, petting Vagar's snout with his free hand while holding Daemon with the other. See, girl, this is my boy, another rider for the skies. Vagar let out a low, vibrating hum that caused the stone floor to crack. Mana Awakening. 1.63% right pointing arrow 1.85%. Genetic Memory Fragment unlocked. The flight over the Roibi. A flash of memory not his own, but Vagar's seared through Daemon's mind. A sky filled with 300 dragons. The scent of boiling water and the screams of a dying civilization. So much power, Daemon thought, his vision swimming in green and gold. If I can master the tower, I won't just ride a dragon like Vagar. I will be the one who commands the very essence they breathe. As Alyssa stepped forward to lead them away, Vagar's massive eye remained fixed on the infant until the shadows swallowed them. New skill gained. Ancient Will passive. Description: derived from the soul scan by Vagar. Effect: the user's mind is now partially hardened against mental intrusion and dragon fear. You can look any beast in the eye without flinching. The darkness of the nursery was absolute, save for the faint, silvery glow of the moon reflecting off the red keep's high windows. But for Daemon, the real light was within. His consciousness drifted, detaching from the soft weight of his infant body and descending into the obsidian depths of his mind. He stood once more in the center of the magic tower. The silence here was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, low-pitched hum of thousands of glowing scrolls. The air smelled of ozone, ancient parchment, and the metallic tang of dragon fire. The first floor, once a barren hall of shadow, had transformed into a grand, circular archive, a cathedral of lost knowledge. He walked toward the center, where a massive obsidian monolith pulsed with a rhythmic, violet light. Words began to carve themselves into the air, burning with an intensity that made his phantom form tremble. Tower log. Core objectives identified. Secondary purpose. Restore the magic of Valyria. Status. Initiated. Current progress. 1.63%. The Age of Awakening. Task. Reclaim the lost arts of blood binding, Valyrian steel forging, and worm speech. Primary purpose. Redacted. Level insufficient. Status. Locked. Current heir. Daemon Targaryen. Secondary. Daemon stared at the glowing runes, his mind whirring. The restoration of an entire lost civilization's magic, the very thing that made the Freehold the masters of the known world, is merely a side effect. The implication was staggering. If restoring the heights of Valyrian power was just the foundation, what lay at the top of the tower? What was so vast that it made the magic of dragons seem like a secondary concern? The tower didn't answer. Instead, it pulsed again, shifting the data to his immediate needs. Next requirement. The anchor. Objective. Acquire primary dragon bond. Reasoning. A human soul cannot withstand the mana pressure of the higher floors without a draconic conduit. Warning. To maximize tower growth, the user must not merely ride a dragon, but synthesize with one. Daemon's phantom lips curled into a predatory smile. He understood. The Targaryens of this era were merely passengers on their beasts. They used saddles and chains, they spoke commands, but they didn't merge. The tower was demanding something much deeper. A soul bond that would turn him and his dragon into a single, localized storm of arcane power. Suddenly, a sound bypassed his physical ears and echoed directly into the tower's hall. R-O-O-O-O-O-O-A-R-R-R-R-R. It began with Caraxes from the High Dragonmont, a piercing, melodic shriek. It was answered by the deep, earth-shaking rumble of Vagar beneath the city, her voice vibrating through the very bedrock of the hill. Then came Melis, her roar a whip crack of defiance. In the city below, the common folk clutched their blankets in terror, praying to the Seven. They heard the sounds of restless monsters. But Daemon, standing in the heart of his glowing library, heard the truth. The roars weren't screams of hunger or territorial rage. They were a salute. The mana in the air was swirling, drawn toward the Red Keep like a whirlpool. The dragons weren't just making noise, they were acknowledging the return of a master. Celebrate while you can, Daemon thought, his violet eyes reflecting the violet light of the scrolls. When I wake, the world begins to change. He closed his eyes, his consciousness snapping back into his small, warm body. He fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, fueled by the stolen mana of the conquest. 7 comments 0 vote. The whisper of old Valyria. The morning that dawned over King's Landing was not the golden, peaceful sunrise the capital was accustomed to during the reign of the old king. The sky was a bruised, heavy crimson, and the air held a static charge that made the hair on the arms of the city watchmen stand on end. The small folk of King's Landing woke not to the sound of bells or the cries of fishmongers, but to a primal discord that vibrated through the very soles of their feet. Across the city, the harmony of the great dynasty was visibly fraying. In the high, cavernous reaches of the dragon pit, the order of the day was shattered. Melis, the Red Queen, usually the most spirited and eager of the dragons, had turned into a snarling tempest. She snapped her massive, jagged jaws at the dragonkeepers, her golden eyes flashing with a frantic, unreadable intelligence. When the keepers offered her a fresh carcass of prime mutton still steaming and bloody, she didn't tear into it. Instead, she let out a plume of smoke that smelled of singed copper and turned her head away, her tail lashing against the stone floor with the force of a falling siege tower. Deep beneath the hill of Rhaenys, in the darkest, most ancient bay of the pit, Vagar stirred. The hoary old bitch let out a low, tectonic rumble, a sound so deep it wasn't heard as much as it was felt. It was the sound of shifting mountains. In the cellars of the Street of Flower, the wine in their casks began to ripple in rhythmic circles, and fine dust fell from the rafters of the great sept of remembrance. In the squalid taverns of Flea Bottom, the morning ale sat untouched. The usual rowdy banter had been replaced by a stifling, paranoid silence. Men and women clutched their charms, wooden stars of the Seven or scraps of old leather staring up at the Red Keep with hollow eyes. The dragons smell something in the air, an old tanner muttered, his voice trembling as he leaned against a soot-stained wall. Something old, something that hasn't walked these narrow streets since the conqueror himself breathed his last. This isn't the heat of a summer day, it's the heat of a forge. Red Keep, Maegor,'s Holdfast. Inside the royal apartments of the Red Keep, Princess Alyssa stood by the window, watching the sun crest the horizon. She held Daemon in her arms, but her usual boisterous laughter was absent. She looked down at her son. The infant wasn't sleeping, he was staring at the rising sun with an intensity that felt predatory. As a stray beam of light hit his silver-pale hair, Alyssa blinked. For a fraction of a second, she swore she saw faint violet sparks, tiny arcs of lightning flicker in the air around his head. "What are you, little flame?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and a mother's burgeoning fear. Daemon didn't blink, he simply leaned into the heat. As the heavy crimson sun fully crested the horizon, Daemon's physical eyes finally closed, but his consciousness did not find rest. Instead, the gravity of the magic tower seized him, pulling his soul through the black corridors of his mind until he stood before the great obsidian gates of the Valyrian genetic archive. Alert. Condition met. Solar draconic resonance. Accessing core memory. The zenith of the Freehold. Synchronization. 100%. The nursery, the scent of lavender, and the sound of his mother's breathing dissolved into nothingness. He was no longer a sleeping infant in his mother's embrace. He was a titan of the sky. Daemon felt the immense, rhythmic beat of wings, vast membranes of leather and muscle that displaced entire clouds with every stroke. Below him, the world was a jagged masterpiece of volcanic fire and obsidian stone. This was Valyria at the height of its terrifying glory. The landscape was dominated by the 14 flames, the massive volcanoes that stood like sentinels of the world's end. From their peaks, rivers of molten gold and violet lava flowed into the sea, creating steam clouds that rose miles into the air. He looked to his left and right. Hundreds of dragons' beasts that made Vagar look like a hatchling choked the sky, their scales shimmering in every metallic hue imaginable. Above the smoke, the capital city rose like a dream of glass and steel. Massive towers, fused together by dragonfire and gravity-defying sorcery, pierced the very heavens. In the high plazas, he saw them, the dragonlords. They stood in circles of blue flame, their silver hair whipping in the wind. They weren't just riders, they were weavers of the world. With rhythmic chants and obsidian staves, they bent the clouds, redirected the flow of magma, and whispered to the dragons as if they were extensions of their own limbs. A voice, sounding like the grinding of tectonic plates and the ringing of 1,000 silver bells, echoed through his skull. "We were not kings, little heir, we were gods." The vision suddenly shifted. The vibrant violet and gold of the Freehold bled into a sickening, bruised purple. The 14 flames didn't just smoke, they shuddered. The very air began to scream as the ley lines of the world snapped like overextended bowstrings. Just as the first explosion of the cataclysm began to ripple through the earth. Just as Daemon leaned forward to see the face of the one standing at the center of the destruction, the image shattered. He was back in the void of the tower. A massive red window flared with a violent, jagged warning. Archive fragment corrupted. Event: the doom of Valyria. Primary cause: unknown. Secondary cause: redacted by external arcane interference. Status: records manually erased. Daemon's mental form tightened. Manual erasure. This wasn't a natural disaster or a lost record. Someone had reached into the foundational memory of the Valyrian soul and torn the pages out. The tower, for all its ancient power, had been blinded. Far away, in the heart of the Red Keep, the great hall was filled with the low hum of courtly business. King Jaehaerys I sat upon the Iron Throne, listening to a tedious petition regarding grain taxes from the Reach. Suddenly, the air in the hall grew frigid, then unnaturally hot. The torches lining the pillars flickered, their flames turning a sharp, electric blue before dying out entirely. A gust of hot, dry wind swept through the chamber, smelling of salt, sulfur, and something impossibly old. The king's hand froze on the arm of the throne. He didn't hear the petitioner, he heard the sudden, unified silence of the city. Then, from the direction of the dragon pit, a roar erupted. It wasn't the roar of a hungry animal or a territorial beast. It was a long, mournful note of recognition, a salute to a ghost. The king's eyes clouded with a shadow and a look of recognition he hadn't worn since the early, turbulent days of his reign. The dragons have not sounded like that since the days of Aegon the Conqueror, Jaehaerys whispered to himself, his voice cracking like dry parchment. He looked toward the massive doors, his grip tightening on the scepter. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones. The peace he had spent decades building was being eroded by a tide of ancient fire. In the council of the conclave, Deep within a chamber accessible only by those who wore the heavy iron and Valyrian steel links of an archmaester, a black cloud of ravens had finally settled. The floor was littered with discarded scrolls, each bearing the seal of the Red Keep or the frantic scribbles of maesters stationed in King's Landing. At the head of the long, scarred weirwood table sat Archmaester Theomore, a man whose face was as cold and bloodless as the stone walls around him. Beside him was Archmaester Ronell, whose trembling hands clutched a report detailing the spontaneous ignition of a tapestry in the royal nursery. "The reports are consistent," Ronell whispered, his voice cracking like dry autumn leaves. "Unexplained atmospheric distortions, heat waves that defy the season. And the dragons, they are no longer behaving as beasts. They are behaving as subjects." Theomore leaned forward, the light of a single candle casting long, skeletal shadows across the table. "We spent a century convincing the world that the glass candles were dark and the age of sorcery was a fever dream of the past. We built a world of logic, of seasons, of kings who listened to reason rather than the roar of monsters." He slammed a withered hand onto a report centered on the birth of Prince Daemon. "If the old Valyrian magic is returning through this child, the order we have meticulously constructed will crumble into ash. A dragon lord who can command the higher mysteries is not a king, he is a god. And men cannot be governed by gods." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. The senior archmaesters looked at one another, their eyes reflecting a shared, ancient fear. "We must watch him," Theomore commanded, his voice dropping to a low, lethal murmur. "If the prince truly is the spark for a second Valyria, we must ensure that spark is smothered before it becomes an inferno. The world belongs to men of grey, not lords of fire." That night, as the maesters plotted in the dark, Daemon's soul was pulled back into the ethereal plane. But this time, it was not a memory of the past. He stood in a vast, ash-covered field that stretched toward a horizon of boiling clouds. In the center of this wasteland lay a skeleton of a dragon so gargantuan it dwarfed even Vagar. Its bones were fused into the volcanic rock, turning the landscape into a graveyard of giants. A voice, spoken in the ancient, melodic tongue of High Valyrian, vibrated through his very teeth. "Find the lost flame, or the world will burn again." The eggs of the Freehold were not all lost to the sea. In the hollow, cavernous eye socket of the massive skull, a pair of ancient, golden eyes snapped open. They burned with a light that felt like the birth of a star, pinning Daemon's soul to the spot. Daemon snapped awake in his cradle, his tiny heart racing. The interior of the magic tower was flashing with a violent, jagged crimson light, a warning system he had never seen before. Next objective updated. Requirement: primary dragon bond. Estimated time limit: 8 years. Failure risk: soul collapse, spontaneous combustion. Warning: the user's mana core is expanding at an exponential rate. The human vessel cannot act as a containment unit for much longer. Without a dragon bond to act as a mana sink, the user's physical body will incinerate from the inside out. 6 comments 0 vote. The Prince and the Dead Egg. A single month had passed since the birth of Prince Daemon, and the Red Keep had settled into a state of watchful anxiety. The atmosphere in the royal nursery, once filled with the rhythmic humming of Queen Alysanne, was now thick with a heavy, unnatural silence. Beside the gilded cradle of the prince sat a low obsidian pedestal. Upon it rested the dragon egg placed there on the night of his birth, following the ancient tradition of House Targaryen. But where the eggs of his brother Viserys or his cousin Rhaenys had pulsed with a faint, internal heat, some even glowing with a dull luminescence, Daemon's egg was an anomaly of shadow. It was a dense, abyssal black, shot through with streaks of dull, mossy green that looked more like verdigris on ancient bronze than living shell. To the servants who changed the linens, the egg felt like a lump of river ice. There was no vibration, no heartbeat, no warmth. It was a beautiful, terrifying piece of dead stone. In the shadowed corners of the Red Keep the maesters gathered in uneasy clusters, their voices lowered to murmurs as if the ancient walls themselves might carry their words to listening ears. Links of gold, iron, and copper chimed softly whenever one of them shifted, the quiet music of their chains echoing faintly through the vaulted corridor. Upon a velvet cushion atop a narrow oaken table rested the dragon egg. For 1 month it had remained beside the cradle of Daemon Targaryen, unmoving and unresponsive. No warmth seeped from its shell. No tremor had stirred within it. It simply lay there, silent, heavy, and cold. Maester Elias leaned in, the brass frame of his Myrish lens clicking as he adjusted the focus. Through the curved glass, the scales of the shell appeared like the desolate mountain ranges of a dead world. His breath hitched, fogging the lens for a brief second before he cleared it. 7 preserve us, he murmured, his voice a dry rasp. It is too heavy. The younger maesters stood back, their faces pale in the amber light. Too heavy, surely. The density of a dragon egg varies, Archmaester. Elias did not look up. He took a thin rod of polished steel and tapped the shell. The sound that returned was not the sharp clack of organic material, but a dull, hollow thud, the sound of a stone dropped into a deep, lightless well. The density suggests the interior has hardened beyond all known records, Elias whispered. Petrification, perhaps. The shell is a fortress, yet the life within, he trailed off, reaching out a cautious, trembling hand to touch the black surface. He recoiled as if stung. The cold, he gasped, his fingers curling into a fist. Feel it. Another maester, emboldened by a dark curiosity, extended his hand. The moment his skin met the obsidian scales, a visible shiver racked his frame. He pulled back, rubbing his palm against his robes as if to restore the blood flow. It is not merely cold, the man whispered, his eyes wide. It draws warmth. It pulls the heat from the air, from the skin, from the very room itself. It is a void in the shape of an egg. Silence reclaimed the chamber, heavy and suffocating. From far across the city, the distant, muffled roar of a dragon echoed from the dragon pit, a reminder of the power that was supposed to be gestating within this black stone. Here, in the dim light of the citadel's outpost, that roar felt like a mockery. I have pored over the chronicles from the days of the conqueror to the present, Elias said, his gaze fixed on the silent object. Eggs grow feverish before they wake. They tremble, they smoke with the heat of the fire within. But none behave like this. Then it is dead, the younger maester asked, his voice trembling. Elias hesitated, his shadow dancing long and distorted against the vaulted wall. It is possible the spark was extinguished long before it reached the cradle. Or, he paused, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial low. It may be that the prince himself has smothered it. The others stared at him, the implication hanging in the air like an executioner's axe. The blood of the dragon is a volatile thing, Elias continued. Perhaps in this child, it burns with a ferocity that the fragile life inside the shell could not endure. If the infant's presence overwhelmed the hatchling's spirit before it could even draw breath. He did not finish the sentence, for the thought was a dangerous one. To suggest a prince was a consumer of life before he could even walk was a path that led to the dungeons. But rumors did not need the permission of kings to travel. By nightfall, the whispers had escaped the maesters, steady like a rising fog. They curled through the kitchens, where the heat of the ovens could not dispel the chill of the story. They drifted through the barracks of the city watch and into the drafty servants' quarters. The story took on a life of its own in the castle's long shadows. Some said the dragonblood in Daemon Targaryen was so potent it had incinerated the hatchling in its sleep. Others claimed the egg was cursed, a shard of the doom brought to the cradle. By the time the moon hung high and silver over the towers of the keep, the whisper had become a settled truth in the hearts of the many. The prince had been given a gift of stone. He had been born to a dead legacy. Beneath the velvet cushion, the egg sat in the dark. Cold, heavy, patient. The maesters had judged it by the laws of life they understood. They had measured its weight and felt its chill, and they had found it wanting. They did not see the thin, violet threads of mana beginning to weave through the petrified core. They did not hear the silent, tectonic shift of a mind that was not dying, but waiting. Princess Alyssa would hear none of it. She strode into the nursery, the scent of the sky still clinging to her cloak, and glared at the maesters until they retreated into the shadows. A dragon does not choose weak blood, she snapped, her voice echoing off the stone vaults. She picked up the cold, heavy egg and tucked it directly into the cradle beside Daemon, pressing the black shell against his silver-tufted head. He is a dragon, it is a dragon, they will settle it between them. As soon as Alyssa left, the nursery fell into a deep, heavy stillness. Daemon opened his eyes, he reached out a small, uncoordinated hand and pressed his palm against the frigid surface of the egg. The magic tower roared to life instantly. Draconic artifact detected. Object: dragon egg, primary. Status: dormant, stagnant. Energy signature: critical instability. Deep scan initiated. Dormancy cause: incompatible bond architecture. Analysis: the dragon's soul within is not sleeping, it is rejecting the current mana environment. Daemon's mind sharpened. It's not dead, he realized. It's stubborn. That night, as the Red Keep slept, Daemon didn't pull mana into himself. Instead, he reversed the flow. Using the tower as a lens, he allowed a thin, needle-like stream of refined mana to leak from his core into the egg. The reaction was microscopic. The black shell didn't glow, but it ceased to be cold. For a fleeting second, the egg trembled in a single, violent shiver that moved the silks of the cradle. Then, it went still. The tower sent a cold assessment. Bond attempt, failed. Soul compatibility too low. The realization struck Daemon with the force of a physical blow. The magic tower flared, its obsidian walls vibrating as the genetic archive struggled to map a bloodline that was practically a relic. Core analysis updated. Lineage: primordial Valyrian, untainted. Classification: Apex Predator, King Class. Note: this DNA signature predates the softening of the Targaryen bloodline. Resonance check: 100% match with Dream Echo, the Lost Flame. Daemon's mind raced back to the vision of the ash-covered field, the gargantuan skeleton buried in volcanic rock and the haunting whisper, "Find the lost flame, or the world will burn again." He looked at the egg with newfound clarity. The dream wasn't a warning about the future, it was a beacon for the present. The lost flame wasn't a sword or a crown. It was the creature inside this shell. This egg wasn't cold because it was dead. It was cold because it was a singularity of draconic power that had survived the doom, refusing to hatch for the tame lords of Westeros. It had been waiting for a soul that spoke the language of the old Freehold, a soul like his. Daemon did not pull his hand back from the freezing shell. Instead, he leaned into the frost. Inside the tower, he threw open the gates of the first floor, the violet light of the library turning into a blinding supernova. "You think I am like the others?" Daemon projected, his mental voice a jagged blade. "I am the heir of the tower. I have walked the memories of the zenith. I am the only master you will ever have." He didn't just leak mana, he unleashed it. A torrential surge of raw, violet energy poured from his tiny palm, cracking the air with the scent of ozone. He forced his power into the void of the egg, filling the ancient emptiness with his own absolute will. "Bow your flame to mine." The egg didn't just warm, it snarled. A mental shockwave rippled back at him, a roar of pure, unadulterated primal fury that threatened to shatter his infant mind. The wild soul inside the egg lashed out like a cornered beast, its ancient instinct refusing to be chained. But Daemon didn't flinch. He used the tower as an anchor, grinding the dragon's will beneath his own. He wrapped his mana around the creature's core like chains of Valyrian steel, tightening them until the resistance turned into a desperate, vibrating hum of recognition. Tick. The sound echoed through the nursery like a snapping bone. A single, razor-straight crack appeared on the crown of the egg, glowing with a faint, ghostly violet light that pulsed in time with Daemon's own heartbeat. System notification. Bond status. Hierarchy established. Lineage synchronization. The lost flame awakens. Hatching probability, 80%. Warning. The entity detected is a wild variant. It will recognize no authority but the user. It is not a companion, it is your shadow. Daemon stared at the glowing crack, his violet eyes mirroring the cold light of the shell. The maesters were right, the egg was different. But they were fools to think it dead. It was a fragment of the old world. 2 months later, the Red Keep was cloaked in the heavy, humid heat of a summer night. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the nursery. The maesters had long since stopped visiting the egg, convinced that the hairline fracture was merely a result of the extreme cold causing the shell to brittle. They had written it off. They were wrong. Daemon sat up in his cradle. He was now 3 months old, his movements possessing a grace and strength that made his wed nurses whisper about dragon child. He didn't look at the toys or the silk hangings. He looked at the egg. The black surface was no longer dark. It was webbed with a network of glowing violet veins, pulsing in perfect synchronization with Daemon's own breath. Crack. The sound was not a tiny tick this time. It was the sharp, violent snap of stone being cleaved by an axe. A piece of the obsidian shell fell away, hitting the padded floor with a heavy thud. From within the darkness of the egg, a wisp of pale, silvery steam drifted out, cold as the wall, smelling of ozone and ancient ice. Scrape. A second shard fell, then a third, then, a limb emerged. It was not the scaled, red or black claw typical of a Targaryen hatchling. It was a white-silver paw, covered in scales so fine they looked like polished pearls. The claws were obsidian black, curved and sharp as needles. The paw gripped the edge of the jagged shell, the strength in the small limb causing the rest of the egg to fracture instantly. Alert. Primary bond acquired. Entity identified. The lost flame ancestral variant. Coloration: moonlight silver, ghost white. Status: synthesized with air of the tower. The hatchling hauled itself out of the wreckage. It was sleek and serpentine, its scales a shimmering, ethereal white that seemed to drink the moonlight. It didn't let out a high-pitched chirp. It let out a low, vibrating hiss that resonated with the very foundation of the magic tower. It turned its head. Its eyes were not the gold or orange of the Westerosi dragons. They were a piercing, crystalline violet, identical to Daemon's own. The dragon crawled across the silk sheets, its movements fluid and predatory. It reached Daemon and, instead of seeking warmth, it pressed its cold snout against his chest, right over his heart. Daemon smiled, his fingers tracing the silver scales of the beast's neck. Welcome back, he thought, the tower's library glowing with a new, intense light. 6 comments 0 vote. The Prince and the Silver Shadow. Year 82 after the conquest. A deceptive peace hung over the 7 kingdoms, anchored by the long, steady reign of the old king. But within the thick, dragon-scorched walls of Maegor's Holdfast, the air had begun to vibrate with a frequency that defied the laws of the maesters. Dawn broke over the Blackwater in a wash of pale gold and bruised violet, the light creeping through the narrow lancet windows of the royal nursery. To the city outside, Prince Daemon Targaryen was a marvel and a robust, silver-haired babe of 1 year who had bypassed crawling entirely to walk with a disturbing, predatory grace. But within the sanctum of his chambers, a deeper truth lay coiled in the dark. Tucked beneath a massive, iron-bound chest lined with the furs of white wolves from the north, something stirred. For a year, the world had believed the Stoneheart egg remained a dead relic. The rumors had settled into a comfortable narrative of the prince's first failure. Only a ghost circle of souls knew the truth. Princess Alyssa, whose wild laughter had nearly shaken the rafters on the night of the hatching, King Jaehaerys and Queen Alysanne, who watched the boy with a mixture of hope and mounting dread, and a single, iron-willed wet nurse who had seen the violet light and sworn her soul to silence. From beneath the furs, a head emerged. It was not the blunt, reptilian snout of a common hatchling. The creature that crawled toward Daemon's cradle was a masterwork of ancient biological sorcery. Its scales were not merely silver, they were the color of moonlight caught in a spider's web, ethereal, translucent, and shimmering with a cold, internal light. Its claws were slivers of polished obsidian, and its wings, when unfurled, possessed a span that defied its 1-year growth. But it was the eyes that truly terrified the few who had seen them. They were not the burning amber or sunset orange of the pits, they were a crystalline, piercing violet, a perfect, haunting mirror of Daemon's own. Daemon sat up in his bed, his small hand reaching out. The dragon did not chirp. It did not seek warmth. It moved with a terrifying, silent fluidity, its neck arching like a cobra. Daemon had named it Nyrax. The dragon pressed its snout against Daemon's palm. It wasn't a pet, it was a shadow. It watched the world with a cold, analytical patience that suggested it was remembering a time when men were nothing more than cattle. Inside the vast, obsidian architecture of Daemon's mind, the magic tower underwent a tectonic shift. For a year, the gears had ground in silence, processing the raw mana siphoned from the royal bloodline. Now, as the bond with Nyrax stabilized, a final, triumphant tolling of a bell echoed through his soul. First floor, completed. Current floor, 2, the library of Ash locked. New abilities unlocked. Draconic resonance. You are the epicenter. Every dragon within 5 miles is now a blip on your mental radar. Mana compression. The ability to condense raw energy into physical force. Genetic archive access. Detailed blueprints of Valyrian biological traits are now readable. Daemon closed his eyes, and suddenly, the city of King's Landing became a map of fire. He felt them all. He felt the steady, roaring furnace of Melis, the ancient, earth-shaking rumble of Vagar, the shimmering, rhythmic pulse of Vermithor. But at the center of the dragon pit, he felt something else, a massive dying sun that was slowly turning cold. The Black Dread was a mountain of stagnant mana, a relic of a world that was passing away. But as Daemon's resonance touched the ancient beast, he realized that Nyrax felt different. Nyrax didn't feel like a descendant of Balerion. He felt like a peer from an era before the Dread had even been hatched. As night fell and the candles burned low, the secret could no longer be contained by walls. Nyrax, perched atop the wolf-ear chest, suddenly snapped his wings open. They were translucent, shot through with violet veins that pulsed with mana. With a sharp, whistling hiss, the dragon pushed off. It didn't flutter, it glided. The silver beast cut through the air of the nursery, a streak of moonlight in the gloom. It circled the vaulted ceiling, its obsidian claws scraping against the stone cornices, before descending in a perfect, silent arc. It landed not on the floor, but on the edge of Daemon's cradle. Daemon watched, his heart thrumming in synchronization with the dragon's wings. He could feel the lift, the drag, and the sheer exhilaration of the wind through their shared bond. Nyrax was growing at 4 times the rate of a normal dragon. The tower was feeding the beast, and the beast was anchored to the tower. At that exact moment, across the city, the peace of the dragon pit was shattered. The younger dragons began to shriek, their cries echoing up the vents of the Hill of Rainies. The dragonkeepers rushed to the pens, hooks in hand, fearing a fire or an intruder. But the source of the disturbance was deeper. In the great hall of the pit, where the shadows were thickest, the largest mass of muscle and scale in the known world began to move. Valyrian the Black Dread, who had spent years in a state of near-permanent lethargy, opened his eyes. A low, thunderous roar and a sound that hadn't been heard in years, vibrated through the very bedrock of King's Landing. It was a roar of challenge, of recognition, and of a deep, ancient fear. The dragonkeepers fell to their knees. They didn't understand. They thought the ancient beast was dying. They didn't realize that Valyrian hadn't smelled a rival. He had smelled a master. The nursery door creaked open. Princess Alyssa stepped in, intending to check on her son before retiring. She froze. There, in the center of the room, stood Daemon. And perched on his small, sturdy shoulder was the silver-white dragon, its violet eyes glowing in the dark. Nyrax let out a low, vibrating hum, a sound that resonated with the blood in Alyssa's own veins. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, Alyssa began to laugh. It wasn't the laughter of a worried mother, it was the wild, reckless cackle of a dragon rider who had just seen the future. She stepped forward, kneeling before her 1-year-old son, her eyes bright with tears of pride. "Of course," she whispered, reaching out to stroke Nyrax's shimmering scales. "Of course you would hatch a monster, my little flame." Quote, ========================================================================================================================He descended past the layers of his own subconscious until the floor beneath his feet solidified into polished obsidian. The first floor of the magic tower had transformed. What had once been a skeletal framework of shadow was now a vast, circular cathedral of black stone. High above, the vaulted ceiling was lost in a swirling nebula of violet mist. Carved into the walls, thousands of ancient runes rotated in slow, mesmerizing orbits, casting a rhythmic violet pulse across the floor. Floating crystal tablets, shards of the Valyrian genetic archive drifted through the air like schools of glass fish, humming with the weight of lost centuries. At the very center of the chamber stood a monolithic pedestal of glowing white stone, radiating an aura of cold, absolute authority. First floor access confirmed. Available disciplines: Basic Mana Manipulation Foundation, Runic Foundations Structure, Elemental Spark Ignition. Foundation first, Daemon thought, his mental form reaching out to touch the pedestal. As he selected Basic Mana Manipulation, the tower stripped away his remaining sensory illusions. The black walls of the chamber seemed to turn translucent, revealing the world outside. For the first time, Daemon didn't see the Red Keep, he saw the lifeblood of the world. Mana moved through the air of King's Landing like invisible, winding currents of silk. It pooled in the shadows of the stones and surged in the wake of the dragons in the pit. To the millions in the city, the air was empty. To Daemon, it was a chaotic, beautiful web of violet, red, blue, green and many color threads, vibrating with the energy of creation. Lesson 1. Gather. Instruction: do not command. Invite. Concept: mana is a river, not a slave. Daemon extended his phantom hand. His first instinct born of a conqueror's soul was to seize. He reached out and tried to wrench a passing thread toward his palm. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The violet thread didn't bend, it snapped like a whip. A localized shockwave of arcane static blasted outward, scattering the surrounding mana into a frantic, jagged mess. The tower's walls flashed a sharp, warning crimson. Error. Mana rejection detected. Cuz. User control insufficient. Analysis. High-density intent without precision leads to dissipation. Daemon pulled back, his mental form flickering for a moment. He realized his mistake. He was treating magic like a sword, something to be gripped and swung. But the tower wasn't teaching him to fight, it was teaching him to weave. He closed his eyes, even within the tower. He slowed his mental pulse, drawing upon the deep, meditative focus he had honed in his past life. He stopped reaching. Instead, he lowered his breathing, turning his palm into a gentle, inviting eddy in the great river of the mana. Slowly, the scattered threads began to settle. A single, thin strand of violet light drifted toward his fingers, hesitant as a wild animal. It touched his skin, a sensation of cool, tingling electricity, and stayed. Then another followed. Soon, a soft, spiraling vortex of violet light began to hum above his palm, spinning with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace. The tower pulsed in approval. The rotating runes on the walls accelerated, feeding him a sequence of symbols that burned themselves into his mind. Spell prototype unlocked. Arcane spark. Rank: Initiate. Effect: manifestation of pure mana as light. Demon channeled the gathered spiral. He didn't crush it, he whispered to it. He gave the energy a shape and a point of focus. In the center of his palm, the violet light condensed into a tiny, brilliant speck. With a soft hiss, a flame flickered into existence. It was a violet star, hovering an inch above his skin. It cast no heat and left no char, yet it illuminated the entire obsidian chamber. It was beautiful, cold, and entirely real. For the first time, the weight of his reality truly set in. He wasn't just a prince in a world of knights and dragons. He was a sorcerer or a wizard. Just as demons stabilized the flame, a sudden, violent vibration rocked the tower. It felt like a tectonic plate shifting deep beneath his feet. A second energy signature tore into the chamber, not through the gates, but through the ceiling. It was raw, golden silver, and pulsed with a predatory, ancient hunger. Nyrax. In the physical world, the hatchling had stirred, its bond with demon acting as a bridge. Its draconic mana, wild and untamed by the tower's logic, surged into demon's spell. The violet flame shivered. It turned a blinding, ghostly silver, and the edges of the flame sharpened into the shape of a dragon's wing. Warning: draconic mana interference detected. Source: bonded entity, the lost flame. Effect: spell mutation. Result: arcane spark has evolved into lunar ember. Demon stared at the altered flame. It was no longer a simple spell, it was a hybrid. It pulsed with a cold, draconic malice that felt far more dangerous than the simple light he had intended. The flame slowly dissolved into silver mist as Demon pulled his consciousness back toward the surface. He opened his physical eyes in the dark nursery. The moonlight was spilling across the floor, and the air was still. Beside him, the hatchling had lifted its head. Its violet eyes were glowing with a terrifying intelligence, staring directly into his own. The dragon didn't move, but Demon felt a sense of smug satisfaction through the bond. It had tasted his magic, and it had claimed it. 5 comments 0 vote. The birth of a storm. The year 82 AC drew to a close not with a whimper, but with the biting, frost-laden breath of a winter that seemed to sense the shifting of the tides. The atmosphere within the castle was a thick, suffocating shroud of apprehension. The great hall, usually a theater of ambition and noise, had fallen into a brittle silence. Weeks ago, Queen Alysanne, the soul of the realm, had departed for the Eyrie. Her youngest daughter, the fragile and flower-soft Princess Daela, was nearing her time. Everyone knew the risks. Daela was a creature of glass, frequently beset by fevers and tremors, a girl who had always seemed too delicate for the harsh winds of the Vale or the harsh realities of childbirth. The morning sun filtered through the high, arched windows of the small council chamber, casting long, indifferent shadows across the map of a kingdom at peace. But that peace did not break slowly. It shattered. The sound came first, a frantic, wet slapping of wings against the stone casement, a rhythmic beating that sounded like a dying heart. A raven, its feathers matted with the gray brine of the narrow sea and its beak stained with the red dust of the Vale, tumbled onto the ledge. It did not croak or preen. It simply collapsed, the small parchment tube tied to its leg glinting like a drop of cold blood. The Grand Maester moved to retrieve it, his chains clinking in the sudden, heavy silence, but King Jaehaerys was faster. The old king stood, his movements possessing a sudden, sharp vitality that belied his years. He took the parchment with hands that had held the weight of the 7 kingdoms for decades, hands that remained steady only through a sheer, ironclad exercise of will. The room held its breath. The Lord Chancellor's quill stopped mid-scratch, the Master of Coin froze with a golden dragon clutched between his fingers. As Jaehaerys scanned the cramped, frantic script of the Ares Maesters, the transformation was horrific. The color didn't just leave his face, it fled. The vibrant, regal bronze of his skin turned to the hue of wet ash, his features hardening into a mask of gray, weathered stone. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, seemed to glaze over as if he were staring into the abyss of a future he had spent his life trying to prevent. The letter was a death warrant signed in the ink of inevitability. The Princess Daela, the words seemed to bleed off the page. Labor has come with the frost, the fever devours her, she is too small for the fruit she bears. The maesters of the Vale were not asking for medicine, they were asking for a benediction for the grave. They spoke of the narrowness of the hips and the exhaustion of the spirit. In the cold, clinical language of the citadel, they were already weighing the life of the mother against the spark of the child, preparing to sharpen their knives for the cruelest of choices. Jaehaerys let the parchment flutter to the table. It landed with a sound like a falling leaf, yet to those in the room, it carried the weight of a mountain collapsing. The conciliator, the man who had brokered peace with every lord from the wall to the boneway, finally looked at a conflict he could not negotiate. Outside, the wind howled around the towers of the Red Keep, carrying the scent of winter and the distant, mournful shriek of a dragon. The king looked toward the north, his jaw set in a line of agonizing grief. "She is but a child," he whispered, his voice a ghost of the command it once held. "They are asking me to choose which of my blood remains on the earth." Jaehaerys stood alone at the head of the table. Usually, his wife Alysanne was the anchor at his side, the voice of reason that tempered his steel. But she was weeks away, already in the Vale, likely standing over their daughter's agonizing bed. The distance between them had never felt so vast. The old king looked down at the parchment. The ink was smudged, likely by the tears of the maester who had written it. "The queen remains by her side, yet her presence cannot whiten the bone or cool the blood," the letter had read. The small council chamber was a tomb of silence. King Jaehaerys sat at the head of the table, the devastating letter from the Vale trembling slightly in his grip. The lords, the hand, the master of coin, the grand maester sat like statues, their eyes fixed on the grain of the wood, none of them daring to meet the king's gaze. Then, the heavy oak doors didn't just open, they were thrown wide. The Kingsguard at the door didn't even have time to announce her. Princess Alyssa Targaryen strode in, the spurs on her riding boots ringing against the stone floor with the rhythm of a war drum. She wasn't dressed for court, she was in salt-stained leathers, her silver hair pulled back in a messy braid. "You cannot be here, princess," the master of coins began, his voice weak. "This is a closed ss." "Quiet, Lord Tyrell," Jaehaerys interrupted, his voice sounding hollow. He didn't look angry at her intrusion, he looked like a man drowning who had just seen a lifeboat. Alyssa didn't wait for an explanation. She snatched the parchment directly from the king's hand. Her eyes moved like lightning over the script. As she read of Daela's failing strength and the maester's grim preparations, the temperature in the room seemed to rise. A faint, violet static, the resonance of her dragonblood seemed to hum in the air. "I am going," she declared. She stood at the center of the room, looking less like a princess and more like the warrior Queen Visenya come again. Daela was her sister, her blood, and Alyssa had never been one to wait for the permission of fate or the protocols of graybearded men. Jaehaerys looked at his daughter. In her fierce, unyielding stance, he saw his own stubbornness and Alysanne's fire. He knew that even if he forbade it, she would simply steal a dragon and fly north anyway. He gave a sharp, solemn nod. "Go," the king whispered. "Take the swiftest horses to the harbor. If the winds are fair, you may reach the Eyrie before." He couldn't finish the sentence. Alyssa turned to leave, but as the servants in the hallway began to scramble at her command, she made the decision that silenced the room. "Daemon comes with me," she commanded, her voice echoing through the council chamber. "The prince is but a babe, princess." The Grand Maester protested, his chains clinking. "The journey is arduous, the mountain passes are treacherous. I will not leave my son in a castle that smells of graves and indecision," Alyssa shot back, her gaze lingering on the stone-faced counselors. "He is a dragon. The cold of the Vale will not break him, but the stagnation of this court might." I watched from the shadows of the hallway as my mother strode out of the chamber. I was a silent observer to the panic of the adults. As Alyssa scooped me up, her leather armor pressing against my chest, I felt the dilemma gnaw at me. I leaned my head against Alyssa's shoulder and whispered into the air, my voice low and steady. "We go, mother. We save her." Alyssa froze for a heartbeat, hearing the clarity in my voice, the voice of a man grown hidden in the throat of a child. She didn't question it, she only tightened her grip and walked faster toward the courtyard. The carriage jolted as we cleared the Lion Gate, but I felt none of the motion. My consciousness was anchored within the tower, where the violet runes were spinning in a frantic, agitated blur. I am nearly 2 years old in this life. 2 years of observing a world that thinks I am a child, while I am actually a ghost from a future that hasn't happened yet. History is a fixed line, I thought. Daela dies in 82 AC. She gives birth to Emma Arryn, the cousin who will marry my brother Viserys and eventually die in a bed of blood herself, birthing a son who lives for only a day. I could let history take its course. Or if I save Daela, I save Emma's mother. I might prevent Emma's marriage. I might prevent the very existence of Rhaenyra Targaryen. I might erase the dance of the dragons, or I might create something far worse. A butterfly's wingbeat in the Vale could become a hurricane in King's Landing. I leaned back against the firs, feeling the weight of the cheat I carried, foreknowledge. It is a heavy burden to hold the threads of fate in a 2-year-old's hand. Then, I remembered her. A few moons ago, Daela had visited the Red Keep before her pregnancy confined her to the Vale. She had knelt before my cradle, her hair smelling of lemon cakes and summer rain. She had smiled at me, a timid, genuine smile, and whispered that I had kind eyes. She was the only one who didn't look at me with fear or awe. She just saw a nephew. But then I looked at my mother. I saw the fierce love in her eyes, the desperation to save her sister. I remembered that in 2 years, it is her turn to face that bed of blood. If I stand by and watch my aunt die because I'm afraid of ripples, I am a coward, I thought. And the world does not reward cowards. A sudden, chilling realization washed over me, stilling the chaos in my mind. My presence here is not a quiet observation, I thought. The moment my soul touched this world, the moment the tower anchored itself in my mind and Nyrax shattered that dead obsidian shell, the timeline was already broken beyond repair. My very existence, paired with a dragon that shouldn't be and a power that hasn't been seen since the zenith of the Freehold, is a ripple that will inevitably grow into a tidal wave affecting the whole of Planetos. If the butterfly has already flapped its wings, why should I fear the storm? I felt a sharp, familiar pulse from the furlan chest the servants were carrying behind us. Nyrax was agitated. The silver hatchling sensed my resolve. He sensed that for the first time, I wasn't just observing this world and I was going to war with its destiny. "We are the storm, Nyrax," I whispered, my voice lost in the clatter of the horses. Inside the chest, a low, clicking hiss answered me. The silver dragon was ready. The air of the tower was ready. The Eyrie sat atop the giant's lance like a crown of ice, a pale, jagged spire of stone that seemed to pierce the belly of the winter clouds. Down below, the high road was a treacherous ribbon of white, choked by drifts of snow that threatened to swallow any traveler foolish enough to defy the season. But even the mountain's chill could not compare to the cold, clinical atmosphere inside the high hall. The Vale was no longer a land of soaring eagles and lush greenery, it was a fortress of frost. The winds howled through the moon door, a sound like 1,000 weeping women, while the waterfalls of Alyssa's tears had frozen into a massive, silent pillar of ice and a grim omen for the princess who shared that name. Inside the birthing chamber, the air was thick with the cloying scent of boiled vinegar, stale blood, and the metallic tang of medicinal herbs. It was a room where the sun never truly reached, lit only by the flickering, guttering orange of beeswax candles that seemed to struggle against the encroaching shadows. Upon the massive hearth bed, Princess Daela Targaryen looked less like a woman grown and more like a broken porcelain doll. Her skin, once the color of fresh cream, was now a translucent, sickly gray, slick with a cold, greasy sweat that no amount of linen could dry. Her silver-gold hair, damp and matted, clung to her forehead in jagged streaks. She was small, too small. Her frame looked skeletal beneath the heavy furs, save for the cruel, swollen mound of her belly that seemed to be draining the very life from her limbs. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged rasp, a sound that tore through the silence of the room like a serrated blade. Beside her, Queen Alysanne was a vision of controlled agony. The good queen, who had mothered a kingdom, looked aged by a decade in a single night. Her regal poise was gone. She knelt on the cold stone floor, clutching Daela's limp hand to her cheek. Her lips moved in a silent, desperate prayer to the mother, her violet eyes red-rimmed and hollowed by a grief that had already begun its work. In the shadows near the hearth, Lord Roderick Arryn paced like a caged animal. The Lord of the Eyrie, usually a man of iron and mountain stone, looked utterly shattered. His knuckles were white as he gripped the hilt of his sword, his eyes darting between his dying wife and the 3 maesters whispering in the corner. Maester Lemise whispered, his eyes fixed on a bowl of milk of the poppy. "The fever is the fire that will consume them both. We must prepare." "The king's mandate?" another asked. Lemise looked at the queen's back and then at the sharpened blade resting on a clean cloth. The child is the priority. We wait for the final pulse. When the mother's heart falters, we take the babe. It is the only mercy left. 5 comments 0 vote. The light that defied death. The ascent to the eyrie was a blur of freezing wind and the rhythmic thud of hooves against frosted stone. When the heavy iron-studded doors of the high hall finally groaned open, there was no herald to announce them. No lords came forward to bend the knee. There was only the silence of a tomb. Alyssa strode through the pale stone corridors, her boots echoing like hammer blows, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive grief of the castle. Servants huddled in the shadows of the arched hallways, their eyes red-rimmed and averted. Some were already weeping openly, clutching their prayer beads. The eyrie, usually a place of soaring heights and mountain air, felt subterranean stale, heavy, and waiting for a final breath. The doors to the royal apartments swung open, and a wave of heat hit them and a sickening cocktail of boiled vinegar, old blood, and the cloying sweetness of rot. Daemon, held tightly in Alyssa's arms, saw everything with a clarity that no 2-year-old should possess. His gaze immediately locked onto a small, carved cradle of weirwood and velvet. Inside it, a tiny bundle of lace and wool stirred. A thin, reedy cry pierced the air. Emma Arryn had already been born. She was small and red-faced, her life a fragile spark that had survived the storm. But the source of the room's shadow lay upon the bed. Daemon Targaryen was not recovering. She was drowning on dry land. Daemon felt the tower vibrate within his mind, its analytical runes flaring into life. Through the bond, he could see her vitality. It wasn't a steady flame, but a guttering candle drowning in a pool of black oil. Her skin was a translucent, sickly gray, damp with the cold sweat of a breaking body. Her lips, once the color of spring roses, were white and trembling, catching at shallow, uneven breaths. The furs beneath her were stained a deep, ominous crimson. The premature birth had torn more than just her flesh, it had torn her spirit. As Alyssa moved closer, Daemon's eyes swept the room. He didn't see the mother's mercy, or the Seven's will. He saw filth. He saw the steel instruments resting on a cloth that had already been used to wipe the floor. He saw the basins of water, murky and stagnant. He saw the maesters, hands, stained with the fluids of the birth, moving from the open wounds of the mother to the cradle of the babe without a second thought. Infection, Daemon thought, the logic of his past life surging forward with a cold, righteous fury. Childbed fever, sepsis. To this world, it was an act of the gods. To Daemon, it was a preventable execution. These healers were not saving her, they were the ones who had unwittingly poisoned her. The emotional weight of the room was a physical pressure. At the bedside, Queen Alysanne knelt on the cold stone, her regal poise shattered. She was weeping silently, her forehead pressed against Daela's limp hand. Lord Roderick Arryn stood behind her, his large hand gripping Daela's other arm as if he could physically anchor her soul to the world. Alyssa stood frozen at the foot of the bed. For the first time in Daemon's memory, his mother's legendary strength cracked. She looked at her sister, the girl who had always been the most fragile of the dragons, and she saw a ghost. The 3 maesters, their heavy chains clinking with a sound like funeral bells, finished their ministrations. One of them set a small silver cup of milk of the poppy beside the cradle. "It is for the pain, your grace," the maester whispered to the queen. "There is little else we can do but wait for the stranger." They gathered their things, their faces masks of professional resignation. They bowed low and retreated, closing the heavy oak doors behind them. They believed they were leaving a deathbed. Now, only the blood remained. Daela drifted in and out of the light, her eyes fluttering open to find her mother's face. "Mother," she whispered, her voice so thin it seemed the wind might carry it away. Is it over?" "It is over, my sweet flower," Alysanne sobbed, kissing her knuckles. "Rest now, just rest." Daela's gaze shifted to Roderick, then to Alyssa. She tried to smile the same timid, kind smile she had given Daemon in his cradle months ago. Each word she spoke was a fragment of glass, jagged and costly. It wasn't a fight for life anymore, it was a long, slow goodbye. 6 hours, the tower calculated. Maybe 4. The infection is reaching the blood. The heart will fail before the sun crests the giant's lance. He looked at the untouched cup of milk of the poppy. He looked at the filth disguised as healing. "If I have the power to stop this and I do nothing, I am no better than the maesters," he thought. "I am just another scavenger waiting for a corpse. And I am done watching people die for the sake of a future that has not yet earned the right to exist." The air in the birthing chamber was static, thick with the iron scent of blood and the herbal bitterness of the milk of the poppy. Lord Roderick Arryn, unable to bear the sight of his wife's rhythmic, shallow gasps, leaned over the bed. With a hand that shook like a leaf in a gale, he tipped a silver vial of the poppy's milk into Dayla's mouth. Dayla swallowed instinctively, her violet eyes fluttering before sliding shut. The pain remained, but the awareness of it drifted. Roderick, his spirit broken, could not look at the queen or Alyssa. He simply turned and stumbled from the room, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor like a funeral march. Daemon watched the door close. Through the magic tower, he saw the countdown. 2 hours. The poppy would dull her senses, but the infection was already a tide rising in her blood. Queen Alysanne turned to Alyssa, her voice a hollow rasp. "Take the boy, Alyssa. He has traveled far from King's Landing, and he should not be here to see the end. Let him rest in the guest wing." Alyssa looked down at Daemon. She had tried to leave him in the solar earlier, but he had gripped her hand with a strength that defied his age, his eyes burning with a silent, fierce demand to stay. Now, seeing the gray mask on her sister's face, Alyssa finally nodded. As she turned to carry him out, Daemon leaned into her ear. His voice wasn't a whisper, it was a command. "Wait, mother, I can save her." Alyssa froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She set Daemon on the cold stone floor, kneeling until she was eye to eye with the boy. "Little dragon, what are you saying?" She searched his face, her mind warring with the impossible logic of his words. Alysanne approached, her eyes wide with shock. "Daemon, do you know the weight of those words?" Daemon looked at the two women. He knew the risk, but the maesters were gone, and the room was empty of outsiders. He reached for the only truth they could fathom, the dreams he had shared with them since he could first form words. "You know my dreams," Daemon said, his voice dropping into a low, rhythmic cadence. "The spires of the Freehold, the fire that does not burn, the Dragonlords, and the heat of the 14 flames. I told you of the visions, but I did not tell you all. I did not tell you that I have seen the spells the Dragonlords used before the smoke took them, and I can use them." The royalty of House Targaryen knew the power of the dreamers. They remembered Daenys, who saw the doom. They did not question a child who dreamt of the old world, they only feared what those dreams cost him. "Watch," Daemon whispered. He held out his small, soft hands. In an instant, a ball of vibrant orange fire erupted in his palms. It danced and swirled, licking against his skin, but there was no smell of burning flesh, only the scent of ozone and summer heat. He manipulated the flames like a master pyromancer of legend, the light reflecting in the stunned, tear-streaked eyes of the queen and princess. For the first time, the magic of the Freehold was no longer a myth. It was breathing in the center of the room. Alyssa's lips parted, a small, breathless laugh escaping her, not of joy, but of a woman who had just realized she was holding a hurricane in her arms. "My little monster," she thought, her eyes burning with a reflection of his flame. "You didn't just dream of the old world. You brought it back with you." Alyssanne's gaze darted from the orange fire to Daemon's calm, resolute face. She saw the dreamer in him, but she also saw something older, something that predated the 7 and the laws of her husband. "Great Mother, have mercy," she whispered, her voice trembling. It wasn't just a prayer for Dayla anymore, it was a prayer for the realm. She realized in that instant that the history of House Targaryen had just split in two. There was the world before this flame, and the world that would now be consumed by it. As the fire swirled, the two women looked at each other across the glow. In Alyssa's eyes was a vow of protection, a silent promise to keep this power hidden from the ravens of the citadel. In Alysanne's eyes was the dawning of a terrible duty. Daemon didn't wait for their recovery. He scrambled onto the high bed and sat beside the unconscious Dayla. He placed his tiny palms directly onto the swollen, fever-racked skin of her belly. He closed his eyes, his consciousness merging with the tower. Spell casting. Purify. Rank. Initiate enhanced. Target. Pathogen sepsis. Cost. 75% total mana. A blinding, holy light erupted from his hands. It wasn't the orange of fire, but a white so pure it seemed to erase the shadows of the room. Alysanne and Alyssa shielded their eyes as the radiance spilled out of the windows, illuminating the giant's lance like a second sun. Throughout the castle, guards shouted in alarm as the white glow bleached the stone walls of the eyrie. Inside the light, Daemon felt the filth dying. The germs, the rot, the black threads of the fever were being incinerated by the arcane purity. But the strain was immense. His small heart hammered against his ribs, his mana reserves plummeting toward zero. With a final, desperate push, he shifted his intent. Spell casting. Lesser healing. Effect. Cauterization, tissue restoration. The bleeding stopped. The jagged tears within Dayla's body knit themselves back together under the touch of his silver-violet mana. As the last of the light faded, the room returned to the dim orange of the candles. Dayla was breathing deeply, healthily. The gray tint was gone. Daemon's vision blurred. The world tilted as his child's physique finally buckled under the weight of the magic. He slumped forward, his eyes closing before he hit the furs. Alyssa lunged forward, catching him before he fell. "Daemon," she hissed, pulling his warm, limp body into her lap. Bang! The heavy oak doors were thrown open. Lord Roderick Arryn charged in, sword drawn, followed by a phalanx of knights and the frantic maesters. "What was that light?" Roderick roared, his eyes wild. "What has happened?" He stopped dead. The room was silent. Alysanne was still on her knees, staring at her grandson in awe. Alyssa was clutching the sleeping boy. And on the bed, Daemon Targaryen let out a soft, peaceful sigh, the first breath of a woman who was no longer destined for the grave. 6 comments 0 vote. The silence after the light. The blizzard outside the Eyrie continued its rhythmic assault against the mountain's peaks, but inside the birthing chamber, the atmosphere had undergone a terrifying transformation. The air, once heavy with the iron stench of a slaughterhouse, now smelled of ozone and fresh-turned earth. Lord Roderick Arryn stood in the center of the room, his sword half-drawn, his chest heaving as he stared at the bed. He had charged in expecting to find a slaughter or a sorceress intruder. Instead, he found a stillness so profound it felt unnatural. Dayla lay upon the furs, her breathing deep and rhythmic. The frantic, shallow gasps were gone. The gray tint of her skin had been replaced by a soft, healthy flush. She was not fading, she was sleeping the peaceful sleep of the healed. Roderick's hand trembled on his hilt. This was a deathbed only moments ago, and yet, the stranger had been evicted by a force he could not name. The maesters brushed past Roderick, their chains clinking in a frantic, dissonant melody. They checked her pulse, pressed their palms to her forehead, and exchanged looks of dawning horror. "The fever, it is gone," Maester Lamiz muttered, his voice cracking. "The infection has retracted. It is as if it never existed." They checked the linens, finding the bleeding had stopped completely. Their clinical world was collapsing. They had documented her demise, they had sharpened the knives for the babe. To see her now was to see a defiance of every scroll they had ever studied. She was beyond saving, another whispered, his eyes darting around the room, searching for the logic that had fled. Slowly, the frantic energy of the maesters slowed as they looked toward the witnesses. They saw Queen Alysanne, still kneeling, her face a mask of exhausted awe. They saw Princess Alyssa seated nearby, clutching her son. And they saw Daemon. The boy lay limp in Alyssa's lap, his eyes closed, his breathing heavy and deep. To any observer, he was merely a child who had been overwhelmed by the travel and the tension of the room. Yet, the way the shadows seemed to linger around his small form made the maesters' skin crawl. Before the questions could form on the maesters' tongues, Queen Alysanne stood. Her voice was no longer the broken sob of a mother, it was the iron command of a queen of the 7 kingdoms. "The mother has heard our pleas," she declared, her gaze sweeping the room with a sharp, warning light. "This is a divine turning. A miracle granted by faith in the blood of the dragon. Let no man say otherwise." Her tone was a wall of steel. It left no room for investigation. It was a royal decree, this was a blessing from the 7, and to question it was to question the gods themselves. The room should have been filled with the joyous weeping of a husband reunited with his wife, but instead, the air was brittle. Lord Roderick Arryn did not move toward the bed. He stood rooted to the spot, his gaze darting from the sleeping demon to the preternaturally calm face of his wife. "A miracle." Roderick's voice was a low, jagged rasp that cut through Alysanne's proclamation. He stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching on a stray piece of dried herb. "I have seen men die of a scratch in the veil, and I have seen women taken by the fever in a heartbeat. I saw the gray mask on her face, Queen." He turned his fierce, searching eyes toward Maester Lamiz. "Tell me, Maester, give me the truth of the citadel. Does the Mother's Mercy usually arrive with a flash of light that blinds every guard from here to the gates of the moon? Does a fever simply vanish?" The word was on the tip of his tongue. Sorcery. He opened his mouth to denounce the unnatural heat and the impossible light, his lips forming the first syllable of a word that would have set the veil ablaze. It felt like the breath of the 14 flames, Alyssa interrupted, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. She stood up, holding the sleeping demon with an iron grip. The same flames that forged the crown on your king's head, Lord Roderick. Are you questioning the very blood that allows your house to hold these mountains? The mention of the dragon's fire acted like a physical blow. Roderick recoiled, the political weight of her words crushing his suspicion. Lemieux swallowed his accusation, the S of sorcery dying in his throat as he looked at the princess's hand, which was resting near her dagger. The maesters hesitated. They remembered the blinding white light that had bled under the door. They had felt the static in the air. But they looked at the queen's face, then at the fierce, protective glare of Princess Alyssa, and they bowed their heads. A miracle indeed, your grace, Lemieux conceded, his voice trembling. After a final, redundant examination, they reported that the princess was stable and out of danger. They retreated from the room, but as the heavy doors closed, the suspicion in their eyes burned brighter than the candles. Outside, the servants whispered of the great white light, but their voices were small. Inside the room, the truth remained buried under layers of royal silk. Daemon slept on, his body a hollow vessel, every ounce of his mana spent in that singular, world-altering purge. To the world, he was a tired child. To Alysanne and Alyssa, he was a terrifying mystery. Daela stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking against the candlesmoke. Confusion filled her face. She remembered the pain, the crushing weight of the labor, and then, a warmth. A tiny hand on her belly. Mother, she whispered weakly. Alysanne broke down again, but this time, the tears were a flood of relief. She gathered her daughter in her arms, shielding her from the ghosts of the night. By dawn, Alysanne had regained her regal composure. She commanded the ravens be sent. Daela lives. She is safe. The danger has passed. The black-winged messengers flew south toward King's Landing, carrying the news of a miracle. But they did not carry the truth. The truth remained in the eyrie, sleeping in a furland chair. The storm had passed, leaving the Vale a kingdom of pristine, silent white. Inside the guest wing, Daemon had not moved. His body was suffering the mana burn of a 2-year-old channeling a Hydeir purification spell. Beside him, Nyrax had emerged from his chest. The silver dragon was coiled protectively around Daemon's waist, his violet eyes unblinking, watching the door. Alyssa sat beside them, her fingers gently combing through Daemon's silver hair, her expression a mix of fierce love and profound dread. The door creaked open, and Alysanne entered. Her sharp eyes immediately tracked to the dragon, then to her grandson. Has he woken? She asked quietly. No, Alyssa answered, but his pulse is strong. He is only empty. They decided to wait. If he did not wake by midday, they would have to call a maester, a prospect that terrified them both. Alyssa looked at her mother, her voice a low hiss. Did you send word about him? About what he did? Alysanne's reaction was immediate and sharp. No, such a thing cannot be entrusted to a raven. Letters are read, copies are made in the shadows of the citadel. The realm is not ready for a child who commands the flames. We return to King's Landing in 3 days, Alysanne declared. Only then will we speak of this to the king. In person, in total secrecy. This is no longer a matter of a family saved, Alyssa. This is a matter of the balance of the world. The silence of the room was shattered by a low, vibrating rumble. Nyrax stood up, his scales shimmering, and let out a sharp, metallic roar. Both women spun around. Daemon was sitting up. He looked pale, his silver hair messy, but his violet eyes were clear and unnervingly calm. He rested a small hand on the dragon's head, quieting the beast with a single touch. He didn't look like a child waking from a nap. He looked like a commander surveying a battlefield. He watched them in silence, his gaze lingering on the door where the maesters had been. The miracle had passed. The history of House Targaryen had been diverted from its tracks. Now came the consequences. Alyssa reached him first, kneeling to brush a stray lock of silver hair from his brow. Her hand lingered, checking for a fever that was no longer there. Daemon, how do you feel? She asked, her voice hovering between maternal tenderness and a new, sharp curiosity. Daemon looked at her. His violet eyes were far too clear, devoid of the glassy confusion typical of a child waking from a deep exhaustion. I am tired, mother. But better. Alysanne stood at the foot of the bed, her arms crossed. She wasn't watching his hands or his face, she was studying his composure, the way he didn't fidget, the way he held her gaze. You slept for a long time, she said softly. Do you remember anything? There was a pregnant pause. Daemon tilted his head, a gesture that looked disturbingly analytical. I remember warmth, and then nothing. Alyssa exhaled, a visible wave of relief washing over her shoulders. She wanted to believe the magic had been an instinctive fluke, a dream he had forgotten. But Alysanne did not move. She stepped closer, her shadow falling over the cradle. "You must rest," the queen said, her voice absolute. No strain, no excitement. "Do you understand?" Daemon nodded. "Yes, grandmother." He was obedient. He was perfect. He was, as Alysanne realized with a chill, too perfect. She lingered a moment longer, searching for a crack in the facade, before turning away. She did not believe him for a second. To the casual observer, the area had returned to its routine. Dela continued her miraculous recovery, her laughter occasionally echoing through the solar. Servants resumed their duties, and guards returned to their posts. But the silence of the mountain was now filled with a different kind of noise. Whispers traveled like the wind through stone unseen, but felt by everyone. A miracle had happened, and in a world of harsh reality, miracles were often more frightening than tragedies. In the solitary silence of the rookery, one maester could not find peace. He replayed the scene in his mind, the way the air had hummed, the unnatural stillness of the prince, and the heat that didn't burn. This was not the work of prayer. That night, beneath the flicker of a dying candle, he began to write. He did not use the official ledgers. He used a scrap of old vellum, his hand trembling as he recorded a truth not meant for the eyes of the citadel not yet. Later that evening, Queen Alysanne summoned Daemon to her private oratory. No guards stood at the door. No septas hovered in the corners. She sat in a high-backed chair and studied the 2-year-old in silence for a long, grueling minute. "What happened in that chamber," she began, her tone calm but sharp as a razor, "must never happen again where others can see." Daemon stood still, listening. Power draws attention, Daemon. And attention draws fear. She leaned forward, bringing her face level with his. "And fear creates enemies, child. Even among those who should love you." Daemon didn't blink. He understood more than a child should. He understood the politics of the grey rats at the citadel and the fragility of the dragon's peace. He simply bowed his head in a silent vow. The obsidian floor of the tower was cold, yet it was a different chill than the one biting at the stones of the eyrie. Here, the cold was pure, a mathematical absence of heat that resonated with the high-altitude mana Daemon was currently siphoning. As he sat at the center of the hall, the magic tower began to filter the raw energy he had pulled from the mountain peaks. The mana of the veil wasn't like the sulfurous, volcanic heat of the dragon pit. It was sharp, brittle, and carried the weight of 1,000 winters. System notification. Environmental source detected. High-altitude glacial mana. Status: purging, fever heat, residue. Refining: 82%. 100%. Result: mana core replenished. Daemon felt the void in his chest, the hollow, aching exhaustion from the night before begin to fill. But the energy didn't just sit in his core, it began to interact with the runes of the first floor. The violet light of the hall began to bleed into a pale, crystalline blue. The tower was adapting. It wasn't just storing the energy, it was cataloging the nature of the cold. The floating crystal tablets of the genetic archive swirled around Daemon, their surfaces flickering with images of the far north and the jagged glaciers of the shivering sea. New spell archetype detected. Source: elemental resonance, veil frost. Calculation: combining mana compression plus thermal negation. Spell unlocked. Glacial veil. Rank: initiate. Effect: creates a localized zone of absolute zero. Can flash freeze moisture in the air or create brittle crystalline structures. Daemon opened his mental palms. He didn't seek the orange flame of the previous night. Instead, he visualized the stillness of the giant's lance, the way the snow didn't just fall, but claimed the world in a silent, frozen grip. A fine mist of frost began to spiral between his fingers. It wasn't a spark, it was a cessation. The air in the tower's hall grew so cold that the very shadows seemed to crack. Small, razor-sharp shards of ice formed out of nothingness, hovering in a perfect, lethal ring around his hands. Unlike the lunar ember, which was a chaotic hybrid of his will and Nyrax's fire, this was pure. This was the cold logic of the mountain, bent to the will of the tower. Princess Dela spent her afternoons with Daemon, letting him sit near the babe, Emma. She spoke gently to him and smiled softly, never asking about the night of the fire. But sometimes, when their eyes met, there was a flash of profound recognition. She knew, somewhere deep in the marrow of her bones, she knew he had reached into the dark and pulled her back. She chose to wrap that knowledge in silence, a gift of protection for the boy who had given her a life. "We return to King's Landing," Alysanne announced the following morning. Her voice was firm, brooking no argument from Lord Roderick. The eyrie had become too small. There were too many eyes watching the prince, too many questions lingering in the frost. Staying longer was no longer a retreat, it was a danger. In the dark of the final night, the maester finished his hidden account. His hand shook as he melted the wax to seal the parchment. He did not give it to a raven. He tucked it into a hollowed-out space beneath the floorboards of the library. It was a truth waiting for the right moment to escape, a record of the day the laws of the world were broken by a child. 1 comments 0 vote. The return of Valyria. The Queen's ballroom was a cathedral of Targaryen shadow and flame. High-vaulted ceilings of obsidian black stone arched overhead like the ribcage of a gargoyle, supported by pillars that seemed to grow from the polished floor. Crimson and black silks draped the long, narrow windows, swaying like funeral banners in the draught. Along the walls, the great triumvirate, Valyrian, Vagar, and Nyrax stared down from ancient tapestries, their woven eyes catching the flickering gold of 100 beeswax candles. At the far end of the hall, upon a raised dais of weirwood and stone, Queen Alysanne sat. She was not on a throne, yet the gravity she exerted pulled the air toward her. Beside her stood Alyssa, a cord of high-strung tension, her hand resting habitually on the pommel of her dagger. Lady Jocelyn stood in the periphery, her dark Baratheon eyes sharp and perceptive, alongside a playful Gale. Gale, ever the winter child, giggled as she darted across the liquid fire reflection of the floor, tugging at Daemon's small tunic. Daemon followed, his laughter light, stumbling with the calculated clumsiness of a 2-year-old. To Gale, it was a game. To the watching Alysanne, it was a performance. Even in play, Daemon's movements were too deliberate. He never tripped over the hem of his robe unless he chose to. His eyes never lost their spatial awareness. He was a predator draped in the silk of a babe, indulging a little ant's whim. The heavy oak doors, reinforced with bands of Valyrian steel, groaned open. His Grace, the King, Prince Aemon, Prince Balon. The three men entered with the casual confidence of those who owned the world. Jaehaerys walked at the center, his silver-gold beard neatly trimmed, his violet eyes scanning the room with the practiced ease of a lawgiver. To his left, Aemon and Balon were mid-conversation, their booming laughter echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The mirth died the moment they stepped into the aura of the dais. Jaehaerys halted, his gaze locking with Alysanne's. He saw the line of her jaw and the pallor of Alyssa's skin. The greeting was brief, a bow to their mother, a sharp nod between king and queen. The atmosphere in the ballroom curdled from warmth to crystalline ice. "Leave us," Alysanne commanded. The maesters lingered for a heartbeat, their chains clinking in protest. The Kingsguard glanced toward Jaehaerys, waiting for a countermand. The king looked at his wife, saw the flickering desperation in her eyes, and gave a sharp, downward flick of his wrist. The hall emptied, the heavy doors thudded shut, the iron bolts sliding home with a finality that felt like a gavel. Silence fell, broken only by the soft, innocent pitter-patter of Gale and Daemon's feet. Jaehaerys initially assumed this was a debriefing on Daela's miraculous recovery in the Vale, a matter of state and family. But as Alysanne and Alyssa stepped forward to recount the night of the white light, the king's expression shifted from concern to profound, unsettling gravity. They spoke of the deathbed, the stench of rot, the light that had bleached the world, and the child who had stood at the center of it all. As the story concluded, the silence became a vacuum. All eyes, the king's, the prince's, the ladies, drifted to the small boy standing beside Gale. Daemon stopped playing. He stood straight, his violet eyes unblinking, watching the most powerful men in the world as if they were pupils in his classroom. "Daemon, come here," Alyssa called softly. The boy obeyed. He walked with a rhythmic, silent grace across the liquid fire floor. He reached the base of the dais and bowed low. "Your Grace," he said, his voice terrifyingly clear. Jaehaerys leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Show me," the king commanded. Daemon looked to his mother and grandmother. They offered a subtle, trembling nod. Daemon raised his right hand. He didn't recite a mantra, he simply willed. With a soft hiss, a brilliant orange flame bloomed in his palm. It did not flicker in the draught. It was a steady, high-density orb of solar heat. With a flick of his fingers, the flame stretched, elongating into a miniature arrow of fire that whistled through the air before circling back. Then, he shattered the arrow into 3 small birds of flame. They fluttered around his hand, their wings shedding sparks that vanished before they hit the floor. He closed his fist. The fire vanished instantly, leaving no smoke, no soot, and no scent but the sharp tang of ozone. The reactions were a symphony of shock. Aemon was analytical, his mind trying to find the trick. Balon stepped forward, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and warrior's excitement. Alyssa's pride was shadowed by the fear of what this would mean for her son's safety. Jaehaerys remained a statue, but his eyes, they had sharpened into diamonds. "That is not all," Daemon murmured. He opened his left palm. This time, there was no heat. The air in the ballroom began to twist. A visible distortion, like a heat haze but cold and violent, formed above his skin. A faint wind began to spiral. It grew in a heartbeat, becoming a localized gale that whipped Daemon's silver hair and rattled the silks on the windows. The braziers and candles across the vast hall didn't just flicker, they were snuffed out simultaneously by an invisible pressure. The ballroom plunged into dim, gray twilight. This broke the composure of the room. Balon let out a choked, "By the gods." Aemon was silent, the realization dawning that they were looking at something that defied the known limits of their blood. Lady Jocelyn stepped back instinctively, her hand to her throat. This was not just a trick of the blood. This was the manipulation of the world's fabric. Daemon lowered his hand. The wind ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The silence returned, heavier than before. "That is all, Your Grace," Daemon said simply. Jaehaerys stood. He didn't move with the caution of a grandfather, he moved with the hunger of a conqueror. He descended the dais in 3 long strides, reached down, and hoisted Daemon into his arms. Then, the old king did something no one expected. He laughed. It was a deep, powerful, and victorious roar that echoed through the obsidian arches. It was the laugh of a man who had just realized his house was no longer merely royal, it was divine. "A Valyrian pyromancer," Jaehaerys proclaimed, holding the boy toward his sons. "And more, a Valyrian aeromancer." He turned back to the room, his face alight with a terrifying ambition. "Do you understand what stands before you? These gifts are ancient. They were rare even in the height of the Freehold. Not seen in 10 generations of our blood." He looked at Daemon, his fingers digging slightly into the boy's tunics. "The magic of the 14 flames, the mastery of the sky, it has returned to our blood. Through him." The room shifted. The tension of the miracle had been replaced by a staggering sense of destiny. But beneath the awe of the princes and the pride of the king, the women Alysanne and Alyssa watched silently. They saw the look in Jaehaerys' eyes. They saw the ambition. Daemon, held aloft in the king's arms, looked back at them. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply watched, his violet eyes reflecting the dying embers of the braziers, already calculating the next floor of the tower. The laughter of King Jaehaerys did not just fade, it transformed into a heavy, thoughtful silence that seemed to pull the warmth from the braziers. He set Daemon down, but he did not move away. Instead, he kept a firm, protective hand on the boy's shoulder, his eyes scanning the shadowed corners of the ballroom as if searching for eavesdroppers that weren't there. Jaehaerys looked at his sons, Aemon and Balon, his expression hardening from grandfatherly pride into the iron mask of a protector. "A remarkable display," the king murmured. He stepped closer to Daemon, his shadow looming large against the dragon tapestries. "The power of the 14 flames. The breath of the sky itself." He paused, his gaze dropping to the boy's small, unburned hands. "Now tell me, little dragon, where did you learn it?" Inside Daemon's mind, the magic tower remained a silent obsidian monolith. No system prompts appeared to guide his tongue. He was alone with the weight of the king's scrutiny. "If I speak of the tower, I am a freak to be studied," Daemon calculated. "If I speak of the future, I am a threat to be managed. I must give them a truth wrapped in the myth of our blood." He looked up, his violet eyes wide and unnervingly steady. I do not know if it is from the dream, Your Grace." Balon Targaryen stepped forward, not with the aggression of a warrior, but with the frantic concern of a father. He knelt beside Daemon, his hand resting on the boy's other shoulder, flanking him with the king. "Magic does not appear from nothing, son," Balon said, his voice softer than the king's but laced with an urgent edge. "If someone has been whispering in your ear, you must tell us. Not for punishment but so we can protect you from them." Jaehaerys nodded, his eyes never leaving Daemon's. "Balon is right, there are those who would use a spark like yours to set the world on fire for their own gain." Quote. Daemon let the silence stretch, watching the way the candlelight danced in his father's worried eyes. He felt the genuine terror they held for his safety, a love that was as suffocating as it was shielding. It feels like remembering," Daemon whispered, his voice small but certain. The reaction was a physical shift in the room. Emmon's breath hitched, a look of scholarly hunger crossing his face. But Balin's grip on Daemon's arms tightened not in a threat, but as if he were trying to anchor him to the earth. Memory, Jaehaerys breathed. Memory of what? You are 2 years of age. You have no past. Not my memories, Daemon replied, leaning into the only lie that could protect both his secret and their hearts. The dreams are of old Valyria, your grace. I see the gold towers falling. I see the way the ancestors moved the clouds before the fire took them. When I reach for the wind, the dream just wakes up. It's like the blood is screaming, and I'm just answering. Then it is a legacy, Balon said firmly, standing up and placing himself squarely between Daemon and the rest of the room, his hand resting on the hilt of Blackfire. It is the blood of the Freehold manifesting in its purest, most dangerous form. We aren't looking for a conspirator, Father. We are looking at a miracle that the world will try to kill. Jaehaerys looked at Balon, then at the boy. If the High Septon hears of this, he will call it an abomination. If the Citadel hears of it, they will demand the boy be brought to Aldtown for observation. They would put our blood in a cage to see how it burns. They will do no such thing, Balon growled, his voice a low thunder. I will burn the Hightower to ash and salt the earth of the Reach before I let a single Greyrit touch him. He is a prince of the House of the Dragon. If the gods have given him the fire of our ancestors, then it is our duty to hide that fire until he is strong enough to let it consume his enemies. Jaehaerys raised a hand, silencing Balon's heat. He was no longer thinking as a grandfather, but as the man who held the realm together. The world is not ready for a sorcerer prince, Jaehaerys said coldly. But the House of the Dragon is. If we are to keep this a secret, I must know one thing. He looked back at Daemon. Can you control it, or does the fire control you? If you feel it slipping, if the dreams become too loud, you must tell us. Daemon didn't hesitate. He looked past the king, toward the snuffed-out torches he had extinguished with the wind. Yes, your grace, I can control it. The king nodded slowly, a look of grim resolve settling over his features. He didn't look reassured, but he looked decided. Then from this day forward, your education is mine, Jaehaerys declared. Balon, see to it no one speaks of this. If a single word leaves this room, I will have every tongue in the hallway pulled out. Daemon is our secret. He is the future we did not expect. Balon gave a sharp, loyal nod, his hand lingering on Daemon's silver hair with a fierce, protective warmth. The miracle was over, and the secret had been sealed. AN. Daemon is approximately 2 years old and is also a transmigrator, that is why he can speak fluently. 3 comments 0 vote. The eyes of old Valyria. The great hall of the citadel was silent, smelling of ancient dust and the sharp tang of ink. Beneath the high, arched ceilings, a group of elderly men sat around a table of dark oak. These were the archmaesters, the keepers of the world's knowledge. In the center of the table lay the scrap of vellum salvaged from the Eyrie. It had been brought by a silent messenger, bypassing the royal ravens. Archmaester Ronel, his chain heavy with links of every metal known to man, smoothed the parchment. He read the words of Maester Lemise aloud, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like sliding stone. The light was colder than the moon, the fever did not break, it was incinerated, the child was a glacier in a sweltering room. As he finished, the silence in the room became absolute. To these men, this was not a story of a family saved. It was a report of a structural failure in the universe. It is a fever dream, whispered Archmaester Theomore, the master of healing. Lemise was exhausted. The mountain air is thin. He saw a recovery and dressed it in the ghost stories of the Freehold. Is it? Ronel countered, his eyes sharp. Lemise is a man of the Vale. He has seen 1,000 deaths. He knows the smell of the stranger. He did not write of a miracle, he wrote of a distortion. He tapped the line describing the frost on the prince's fingers. We spent around 200 years pruning the world of magic. We built a world of stars and seasons. If a Targaryen child can now rewrite the laws of death with a touch, our library is nothing but kindling. As the ink dried, the archmaesters made a silent vow. The divine miracle of the 7 would be supported publicly to keep the lords from flocking to the boy, but privately, the citadel would begin to build a cage of logic around Prince Daemon. Fire is a madness, Ronel muttered, repeating the ancient mantra of their order. And we are the only ones who remember how to build the walls against it. The air in the lower vaults of the Red Keep was ancient, a stagnant weight that tasted of drying parchment, cedar oil, and the sharp, metallic ghost of dragonbone resting in the pits far above. Down here, the silence was not an absence of sound, it was a physical presence that listened to the intruder's heartbeat. King Jaehaerys I Targaryen sat in a high-backed chair of dark oak, his posture as immovable as the stone foundations of the fortress he had spent a lifetime perfecting. One hand rested upon the carved arm of the chair, the other idly stroking his silver-gold beard. Beside him, a lone tallow candle burned with a guttering, weak flame, its light bending and shivering as if in quiet deference to the damp, oppressive shadows of the vault. Across from the old king stood Daemon. The boy looked small against the towering arches, his violet eyes wide with a carefully crafted mask of innocence. Between them lay the two obsidian cylinders, one black as a starless night, the other a translucent, sickly green. Glass candles. My mind sang the name before the king could even open his mouth. The magic tower was already vibrating, recognizing the dense, resonant mana stored within the obsidian. I knew their history, I knew they were the internet of the old world, the eyes that allowed the dragonlords to rule from afar. But a 2-year-old doesn't know the secrets of Aenar the Exile. A 2-year-old sees pretty rocks. Tell me, Daemon, the king said at last, his voice a calm, measured resonance. What is it you see upon this table? I stepped closer, tilting my head with a curiosity that was only half-feigned. I reached out a small finger, hovering just an inch from the cold black glass. They are smooth, your grace, I said, keeping my voice light and youthful. Like the toys the stonecutters make, but darker. Is it dragonglass from the mountain? A sharp eye, Jaehaerys noted, though his gaze remained heavy. They are glass candles, child. Relics of a Valyria that existed before the maps were redrawn. I blinked, widening my eyes. Candles, but there is no string for the fire, your grace. And no wax to melt. How does the light stay inside? The king's violet eyes sharpened with a sudden, predatory intelligence. Because they do not burn with oil, Daemon. They burn with the soul. It is said the sorcerers of the Freehold could see across the narrow sea with these, peering into the hearts of stars. They were the eyes of the dragonlords. I let a small shiver run through my shoulders, not because I was afraid of the glass, but because I was afraid of how much Jaehaerys was watching me. To see across the world. That sounds amazing. It is power, the king corrected, leaning slightly forward. The Septons call it sin. The lords call it a myth. But Targaryens have always known it is their birthright. He gestured toward the obsidian. Now, show me what you know, not what you have been told. I have sat this throne for decades, yet I have never seen these stones breathe. Burn them for me. I stepped forward, my small hand hovering over the black glass. I could light this in a heartbeat. I knew the frequency, I could feel the tower aligning its mana to the stone's internal lattice. But to succeed now would be to admit I wasn't just remembering, it would prove I was a master. And a master is a threat. Jaehaerys spoke again, his voice an edge of iron. Do not rush. When a dragon hatches, it does not begin with fire. It begins with breath. I nodded once. I reached into my core, but instead of the refined, singing mana the candle required, I pushed a blunt, clumsy surge of raw heat. I made it look like I was straining, my small face scrunching in effort. Ignite, I whispered. The obsidian trembled. It rattled against the basalt table with a dull, protesting sound. I pushed harder, forcing a chaotic wave of power that had no direction. The air grew stiflingly warm. The flame of the tallow candle guttered wildly and died. Darkness swallowed the vault. The glass candle remained cold. Dark. Silent. Jaehaerys' voice came from the velvet blackness. Tell me what you did. I let my breath come in uneven gasps, feigning exhaustion. I tried to give it my fire, your grace. But it just swallowed it. It felt like a door that has forgotten its key. That, Jaehaerys said softly, is the first true thing you have said tonight. I blinked into the dark, feeling the king's invisible presence. You felt absence, the king continued. Good. Now ask yourself, does absence mean death, or does it mean silence? You are trying to command something you have not yet learned to hear. I lowered my head, hiding the flash of calculation in my eyes. I thought being a dragon was enough. Power is common, Daemon. Understanding is rare. The king's voice seemed to drift through the dark like smoke. Magic is not a beast to be ridden. It is a conversation. You failed tonight because you chose force over patience. The word was not cruel. It was simply a fact. Go, Jaehaerys said at last. I hesitated, my hand lingering near the cold obsidian. Your grace, do you believe they can be lit again? For the first time, Something shifted in the king's voice, a quiet, enduring curiosity. I believe, he said slowly, that the world remembers more than men do. And I intend to learn which of you will remember first. The afternoon sun over the Red Keep was a pale, honeyed gold, casting long shadows across the private gardens of the royal family. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and sea salt from the Blackwater, but to Daemon, the world was composed of something far more intricate. He sat cross-legged on a bench of white stone, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, measured cadence. To any observer, he was merely a contemplative toddler watching the bees. In reality, he was a vacuum. He could feel the ambient mana of the gardens, the green vitality of the weirwood saplings and the faint, lingering heat of the volcanic stones flowing into him, settling into the shifting foundations of the magic tower. A few yards away, the air was filled with the silver bells of laughter. Viserys, barely a boy himself, was chasing Rhaenys around a fountain, while young Gale clapped her hands in delight. "Daemon, come and run," Rhaenys called out, her Baratheon black hair whipping around her face as she skidded to a halt. "The dragons are hunting the stags." Daemon turned his head slowly, his violet eyes unblinking. "The dragon is resting, princess," he replied, his voice far too steady for his stature. "Go on, I am occupied." Rhaenys pouted, a flash of fire in her eyes, before turning back to the game. Daemon didn't miss the two shadows standing at the edge of the greenery. Esser Ryam Redwyn and Esser Clement Crabbe stood like statues of steel, their white cloaks unmoving. They weren't just guarding a prince, they were guarding a secret ordered by the king himself. Suddenly, a violent tremor shook the obsidian walls of his mind. System notification, optimization complete, 100%. Second floor unlocked. The Library of Ash. New passive unlocked. Aura reading. Description: the ability to perceive the aura can detect vitality levels and hidden intent through color and density. The world shifted. It was as if a veil had been torn from his eyes. He looked at the Kingsguard. Their auras were steady, flickering pulses of dull iron and unwavering white. He looked at Viserys, a warm, bubbling pool of golden light, soft and easily molded. Daemon needed to go. He needed to retreat to the silence of his chambers to map this new floor, to see what the Library of Ash held within its smoldering shelves. But as he moved to rise, the world suddenly tilted. A pair of slender, porcelain-white arms scooped him up from behind, pulling him into a lap that smelled of crushed lilies and expensive SOC perfume. "And why is my favorite little gargoyle sitting all alone?" a voice purred near his ear. "Is the sun too bright for your brooding?" Daemon looked up into a face that was often called the most beautiful in the Seven Kingdoms. Valyria Targaryen, his sixth aunt, looked down at him with mischievous, deep violet eyes. Her hair was a shimmering river of silver gold, intricately braided with pearls, and her skin was so flawless it looked as though it had been carved from dragonstone marble. She was 11, radiant, and possessed a wildness that even the queen struggled to tame. To the world, she was a beauty. To Daemon's new eyes, she was a storm. Her aura was a swirling, chaotic vortex of brilliant violet and sharp, jagged streaks of pink vanity mixed with a desperate, burning hunger for attention. "Aunt Visera," Daemon said, forced to endure the embrace. "I was resting." "Resting," she laughed, the sound like silver coins hitting glass. She pinched his cheek with playful cruelty. "You speak like a septon and act like an old man, Daemon. It's unnatural. You should be playing with Gale, or better yet, telling your aunt how beautiful her new gown is." She twirled a lock of his silver hair around her finger, leaning in close. "The king spends so much time with you in those dusty vaults. Tell me, what does he say? Does he speak of me? Does he mention who he intends to wed me to?" Daemon looked at the pink streaks in her aura. They sharpened when she mentioned marriage. She wasn't here for play, she was fishing for the king's secrets through a child she thought couldn't understand them. "He speaks of history, aunt," Daemon replied coolly, his eyes tracing the flickering violet of her vanity. "In stones. He does not speak of weddings." Visera's smile didn't falter, but her aura spiked with a flash of irritation, a quick burst of smoky gray. "Liar. You have that look in your eyes. The same look the old king has when he's hiding a decree." She squeezed him tighter, her voice dropping to a playful whisper. "If you tell me what happens in those vaults, I'll steal a lemon cake from the kitchens for you. Or perhaps I'll take you for a ride on a horse that actually moves faster than a turtle." "I have no need for cakes, Visera," he said, his gaze drifting toward the high towers of the keep where the wind whistled through the stones. "And I do not care for horses. They are too close to the ground. Valyria huffed, tossing her head back so her pearls rattled. You are a cold little thing, aren't you? Just like the wall, but I'll break you yet, little nephew. No one stays bored around me for long. She stood up, still holding him like a prized doll, and began walking toward the fountain. Daemon sighed internally. The Library of Ash would have to wait. He was currently trapped in the grasp of a girl who didn't realize she was playing with a fire much older than herself. 6 comments 0 vote. A graveyard of ambition. The late afternoon sun bled through the narrow, high-arched windows of the Red Keep's primary corridor, casting long, skeletal shadows across the flagstones. Valyria moved through the hallway with the practiced stride of a girl who knew every eye was on her, carrying Daemon like a prize she wasn't yet ready to share. Coming toward them was a trio that caused the passing servants to press themselves flat against the walls. At the center was a girl whose beauty was less of a flower and more of a blade. Sarah Targaryen moved with a magnetic, unsettling grace. At 15, she was a sharper reflection of Valyria, her features less rounded, her silver hair pulled back with a severity that emphasized the calculating coldness of her amethyst eyes. She didn't walk, she prowled. To Daemon's eyes, Sarah was a conflagration. Her aura was a dense thicket of deep crimson streaks, a violent, pulsing rebellion. Beneath that were flickers of brilliant gold, denoting an intelligence far too sharp for her own good, and twisting through it all were threads of oily black. Sarah, the wild heart of House Targaryen. In 2 years, she will break this family's heart and flee across the narrow citadel. Beside her, Lady Perryon offered a polite, shallow smile. But Lady Alice, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not of respect, but of acknowledgement. You're a silent one, aren't you? She said softly, her voice a melodic honey that didn't reach her eyes. Always at the king's side, listening while others speak. Her thumb brushed along his jaw, almost absent-mindedly, though the pressure was firm. Tell me, little prince, when his grace speaks with the queen, does he ever speak of his daughters? Of futures? Daemon leaned into her touch as if seeking balance, his small fingers curling into the silver braid at her shoulder. To the servants passing by, it was a child's simple need for support. Up close, his voice dropped to a whisper intended only for the girl who would one day be the scandal of the realm. I do not hear all the words, Aunt, he murmured, his tiny voice chillingly steady. They speak softly when the doors are shut. He paused, just long enough for the tension to coil. But I heard your name. Sarah stilled. The crimson in her aura tightened, sharpening into a jagged edge of anxiety. What did he say? She asked. The question was too quick, too quiet to be casual. Daemon's gaze lifted to hers wide, open, and utterly empty. He said, he began slowly, as if pulling a fragment from a dream, that you are, much admired. That many would be glad to claim you. A flicker of hope flared in her aura, a bright, desperate gold. But her grace said, Daemon continued, his voice soft and uncertain, that admiration is not the same as obedience. He said that a daughter who brings him honor may yet be given a great match. A lord of high standing. He felt the breath catch in Sarah's throat. He hesitated then, making the next words feel as though they were being dragged out of him. And one who does not, may be given to the faith. To the starry sept, like Princess Maegel. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah went utterly still. There was no dramatic gasp, no outward cry, but something inside her collapsed. The vibrant colors of her aura drained away, replaced by a dull, ashen gray, the hue of shock and cold, calculated fear. Aldtown, she whispered, the word barely formed, a ghost of a sound. Behind them, Valyria shifted, her pearls rattling. What are you whispering about? She demanded, her voice breaking the spell. Daemon, what did you say to her? Sarah blinked, the mask snapping back into place, but it was too fast, the edges jagged. She thrust Daemon back into Valyria's arms with an abrupt, jerky motion, as if the child had suddenly turned into white-hot coal. He said nothing, she replied sharply, though her hands were trembling. Child's babble, less than nothing. Her voice held the command of a princess, but her composure was gone. She turned at once, her stride too fast, her movements too controlled to be natural. Lady Perryon hurried after her, casting a confused look back at the sisters. The seed is planted. If she chooses the path of the good daughter, to escape the sept, she becomes a stable pillar for the house, a high-born lady beholden to the secrets I possess. But if she panics and follows the canon path, fleeing across the narrow citadel, she will not be lost to me. A royal exile in the free cities is a blade waiting to be drawn. Through her, I can exert influence over the Triarchy and eventually reach into Volantis itself. Whether she stays or runs, she is a piece on my board. Valyria pushed open the heavy oak door to his chambers with her hip, disregarding the silent protocol of the Red Keep that demanded a servant announce her. The room beyond was a sanctuary of hushed air and fading gold, washed in the long, amber light of the dying afternoon. She crossed the floor with her usual fluid grace and set him down upon the edge of the high bed. Her touch lingered, a slow, almost unconscious brush of her fingers against his shoulder, as if she were reluctant to fully relinquish her hold on her prize. "Well," she said, tilting her head to the side. She studied him with the intensity one might grant a riddle. "You've been particularly troublesome today." A faint, teasing smile curved her lips, though it didn't quite mask the curiosity burning in her violet eyes. "First, you refuse to play like a proper babe, and then you whisper secrets that send Sarah running like a frightened scullery maid." She let out a soft, melodic laugh that echoed against the stone walls. "I almost wish I had heard it. Whatever it was, it had teeth." Daemon looked up at her from his perch on the silks, his expression an island of calm in the wake of her energy. His gaze was steady, bordering on distant. "I only said what I remembered, Aunt," he replied, his voice small but unnervingly clear. Valyria snorted lightly, though she didn't look away. "You remember entirely too much for someone so small." She reached out, tapping the center of his forehead with a single, manicured finger. "It's unsettling, Daemon, truly." She turned away, pacing a single, restless step toward the window where the blackwater gleamed like molten lead in the distance. She glanced back over her shoulder, her silhouette framed by the orange glow of the sunset. "You should be careful with that. Words have a way of finding the wrong ears in this castle, and the Red Keep has 1,000 of them." Daemon tilted his head slightly, mirroring her own inquisitive gesture. "Are you worried for me, Aunt?" Valyria paused. The playfulness in her aura flickered, replaced by a moment of genuine stillness. Then she smiled, a slow, amused expression, but one that wasn't entirely dismissive. "No," she said, "I'm worried for them." She stepped back toward the bed, crouching slightly so her eyes were level with his. Up close, the scent of crushed lilies and expensive oils was a heady cloud. "You don't cry, you don't laugh, and you look at people as if you're waiting for them to disappoint you." Her voice softened, dropping an octave into a register of rare sincerity. "It's strange, little one. You aren't built like the other boys." Daemon held her gaze, unblinking, his mind already calculating the threads of her future. "I am still learning," he said simply. For a long moment, Valyria simply watched him, searching for the crack in the porcelain mask of his childhood. Finally, she huffed softly and straightened, the pearls in her hair rattling with the movement. "Learn to be a child first," she said lightly, her usual mask of vanity snapping back into place. "It will make life much easier for everyone involved." She moved toward the door, pausing only briefly at the threshold. A familiar glint returned to her eyes, sharp and hungry for the chaos she loved. "And if you are going to go about whispering secrets," she added, her hand resting on the iron latch, "at least whisper them to me next time. I promise to be much more entertaining than Sarah." She didn't wait for an answer. The door closed behind her with a quiet, final click, leaving Daemon alone in the deepening shadows of the room. Daemon didn't move. He remained sitting exactly where she had left him, a small, silver-haired statue in a room of shifting shadows. The chaotic, floral scent of Valyrie's perfume lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the cold, antiseptic clarity of his own thoughts. "The game has begun," he mused, his violet eyes fixed on the grain of the floorboards. He replayed the corridor encounter with clinical precision. Sarah's sudden, ashen terror at the mention of the starry sept, the way her aura had collapsed from a vibrant rebellion into a muddy gray void. Daemon lay back against the cool silk of the coverlet. He closed his eyes, slowing his breath until his heartbeat became a distant, rhythmic drum. The Red Keep, the sunset, and the weight of his infant limbs faded away. He didn't climb, he descended, falling inward toward the core of his being. The magic tower didn't appear as a building so much as an inevitability. It rose out of the obsidian dark of his soul, ancient, silent, and infinite. This was a structure that had existed before language had names for stone or shadow. He bypassed the first floor, the Hall of Awakening, where the draconic runes still pulsed with the steady heat of his recent breakthrough. His consciousness drifted upward, passing through a veil of cold, gray mist until the environment shifted. Second floor, the Library of Ash. The air here was different. It tasted of ozone and the dry, bitter tang of a fire that had gone out 1,000 years ago. Endless shelves stretched into a gloom that had no ceiling, but they were broken and uneven, sagging under the weight of books that weren't made of parchment, but of solidified soot. These volumes were shedding ash like slow-falling snow, the gray flakes drifting through the air in silent, erratic patterns. There was no sun here, only a dim, subterranean glow like the embers of a city buried under ruin. This was not a place where knowledge was kept, Daemon realized, his phantom hand reaching out. This is a place where knowledge has survived destruction. He approached a shelf where a single tome sat, its spine cracked and leaking a faint, rhythmic heat. As his fingers brushed the cover, the book didn't open, it reacted. The ash swirled violently, and the world of the tower shattered. Suddenly, Daemon was no longer himself. He was a man with sun-darkened skin and hands calloused by the handling of dragonglass. He was a Valyrian mage of a minor house, standing in a high, windswept tower over the 14 flames. Before him sat a green glass candle. He felt the man's frustration, a jagged, desperate hunger for the farsight. He felt the heat of the volcanoes below and the crushing pressure of a mind trying to force its will into the obsidian. Ignite, the mage whispered. Daemon felt the overwhelming surge of mana, too much, too fast. The mage wasn't conversing with the stone, he was trying to break it. Then came the fear. The glass didn't light, it buckled. A psychic backlash tore through the mage's mind like a white-hot wire. The vision snapped. Daemon gasped, his phantom form recoiling from the shelf. His breath came in ragged bursts, and his mind felt heavy, as if coated in a layer of leaden dust. He understood now. These weren't books to be read, they were recorded failures. Each volume was a lived experience of someone who had reached for the heights of Valyria and fallen. Knowledge here was experiential and dangerous. You didn't learn the technique by following instructions, you learned it by reliving the moment it went wrong. By experiencing the mage's failure to light the green candle, Daemon now knew exactly what the wrong frequency felt like. He had gained a pattern, a negative space that would allow him to find the true path. But there was a cost. The memories left a residue, a lingering distortion in his own emotions. He could still feel the dead mage's lingering terror at the back of his throat. This is not a library, he thought, looking at the endless, ashen aisles. It is a graveyard of ambition. As he prepared to withdraw, something caught his eye. Deep in the furthest reaches of the stacks, a single book wasn't shedding gray ash. It was glowing with a faint, crystalline blue light, a cold fire that stood out against the embers of the ruin. It felt familiar. It felt like the stillness Jaehaerys had demanded of him. Not all knowledge is accessible, a whisper seemed to echo from the shifting ash. Some must be earned in the dark. Daemon pulled his consciousness back, the weight of the second floor pressing against his mind. He opened his eyes in the nursery, the room now fully claimed by night. His mind felt heavier, aged by the ghosts of the ash, but his resolve was iron. 3 comments 0 vote. Alignment and obedience. The solar of Princess Sarah Targaryen was far too warm. In the corner, a silver brazier burned with a low, rhythmic hiss, the charcoal choked by perfumed oils that turned the air into a thick, cloying soup of jasmine and musk. Heavy silk drapes, dyed the color of dried blood, muted the pale winter sun and cast the room into a perpetual, artificial twilight of gold and red. It was a space designed for comfort, yet to Sarah, it felt like the inside of a silk-lined coffin. She paced. It was not the elegant, gliding stride expected of a princess of the blood, but something sharper, tighter. Each turn came with a predatory snap, her slippers whispering against the stone floor in a frantic, uneven rhythm. For 2 weeks, a single thought had circled the periphery of her mind like a vulture, silent, patient, and utterly unrelenting. She had not spoken of it. Not to her companions, who lived for her favor, not to her septa, who prayed for her soul, not even to herself, lest the words give the nightmare teeth. It lived behind her practiced smiles and her sharp, melodic laughter and a gnawing secret that refused to die. Across the chamber, her companions watched her. Lady Perryon sat poised upon a divan, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression a masterpiece of pleasant vacuity. She had perfected the art of looking without truly seeing. Lady Alice did not share that talent. She leaned against a carved obsidian pillar, her dark, hawkish eyes following Sarah with a quiet, unsettling focus that pinned the princess like an insect to a board. "You're wearing a path into the stone, my princess," Perryon said lightly, her voice a tinkling bell in the oppressive heat. "Shall I call for wine? Or perhaps the harpist to soothe your mood?" Sarah stopped. The halt was too abrupt, her body rigid. No. The word was sharper than she intended, a jagged glass shard of a syllable. A flicker of irritation crossed her face, smoothed away instantly by a mask of royal indifference. She turned, lifting her chin to catch the amber light. I am merely thinking. Of what? Alice asked. The question wasn't soft. It wasn't cautious. It was a direct strike. Sarah's gaze snapped to her, and for a heartbeat, something raw and vulnerable flashed in her amethyst eyes. Uncertainty, quickly buried beneath a landslide of pride. Must I announce every passing thought I have now? Sarah said coolly, her voice regaining its silk. Alice did not blink. If they trouble you enough to steal your sleep, she replied, her voice level, they are usually worth announcing. Silence stretched between them, thin and brittle. Sarah turned again, but slower this time, each movement a calculated display of control. They don't trouble me, she lied, the words tasting of copper. I simply find it curious. Curious, Perion echoed, seizing the softer word as if it were a life raft. Sarah's lips curved faintly, too faint. Yes, tell me, she began, her tone drifting into a feigned idleness. What becomes of daughters who displease their fathers? The question hung in the humid air, heavier than the incense. Perion blinked, her brow furrowing. That depends, surely. On what? Sarah cut in. A beat of silence followed. On how greatly they displease him, Alice answered. Sarah's fingers stilled at her side, curling slightly into the fine fabric of her skirts. And if the displeasure is persistent? She pressed, her voice dropping an octave. Perion laughed, though the sound was strained, like a fraying wire. Then they are married off quickly, I should think. To some loyal lord in the north or the marches who can manage them. Manage, Sarah repeated. The word felt foul in her mouth. Her gaze drifted away from them, fixed on some invisible point beyond the walls. And if that fails? Now, even Perion hesitated, sensing the edge of a precipice. But Alice spoke again, her voice quiet and absolute. Then they are removed. Sarah's breath caught just a tremor, almost imperceptible. Removed, she echoed. Alice inclined her head, her gaze never wavering. The faith is always eager for noble daughters. A life of service is a fine way to wash away a family's shame. The room seemed to plummet in temperature. Unbidden, a name surfaced in Sarah's mind, cold and terrifying, Maegil Targaryen. She saw the image as clearly as if her sister was standing in the room. Silk traded for rough gray wool, fire and dragonsong traded for the damp silence of a cell, a life of vibrant rebellion reduced to a gray smear of prayer and obedience. For a month, that image had haunted her, unformed and unspoken. Now, Alice had given it a name. It was real. Sarah's hand tightened into a fist. That is for the devout, she said dismissively. Too quickly. Is it? Alice asked. Their eyes met, and for the first time, a dark recognition passed between them. Alice tilted her head slightly, her voice a mere whisper. You have never cared for obedience before, my princess. The words struck like a Valyrian steel blade. Sarah's composure fractured just for a second before the iron returned to her spine. You presume much, Alice. Do I? Sarah turned away, moving toward the window. She jerked the heavy curtain aside, letting in a thin, cold blade of winter light. The world outside the sprawling city, the Blackwater, the distant hills looked smaller from this height. Controllable, unlike the storm inside her. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark glass, silver hair, violet eyes, a face of perfect, unshakable poise. A lie. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden, to that sun-drenched corridor a month ago. To a child's voice soft, rasping, and far too old. If you do not, the starry sept. She had tried to laugh it away as a babe's nonsense. She had tried to bury it beneath the wine and the music. She could not. Her breath slowed, forced into a measured cadence. No, she would not be sent away. She would not be silenced. Behind her, Perion shifted uncomfortably, her silk skirts rustling. Perhaps we should speak of something lighter, the tourney, or the new silks from Lee. No, Sarah said. This time, her voice was calm. It was the calm of a general looking over a battlefield. She turned back, and this time, her smile was nearly perfect. You're right, she said, looking directly at Alice. Both girls went still. I've never cared for obedience. She took a step forward, measured and deliberate. The chaotic crimson in her aura, the rebellion that had defined her, didn't vanish, but it suddenly drew inward, sharpening into a point. Perhaps it's time I learn. Perion blinked in surprise, her face brightening with relief. Alice did not smile. She watched Sarah with a renewed intensity, because she heard what was hidden in the princess's voice. It wasn't submission, it was calculation. Sarah moved past them both toward the door, her posture flawless, the very image of a dutiful daughter of the dragon. But as she reached for the latch, her fingers trembled just once before stilling completely. A crown, or chains? For 2 weeks, the choice had hunted her. Now, she had looked the beast in the eye. Her path was laid before her, and for the first time in her life, Sarah Targaryen knew the true meaning of fear. The dreams had long since ceased to be mere hauntings, they had become an inheritance of ash. Through the turning of the year 83 AC, as the winter winds rattled the dragon-carved casements of Maegor's Holdfast, the fractured shards of another's life had begun to cohere. They no longer fled from the morning light. Instead, they waited in the dark, patient and heavy with the stagnant weight of a dead civilization. For a full month, since his phantom fingers had first brushed the spine of that leaking tome in the Library of Ash, Daemon had been a prisoner of a ghost. Each night, he was pulled back to a windswept tower overlooking the 14 flames, forced to inhabit the skin of a Valyrian sorcerer. At first, there was only the jagged rhythm of failure. He felt the man's hands tremble, his breath hitching with a desperate, reaching ambition. He felt the sorcerer pour raw power into the green glass candle, treating the obsidian like a beast to be broken. The answer was always the same, a violent, white-hot recoil that shattered his thoughts into static and left the taste of burnt ozone in his mouth. But as the month waned, the dreams deepened. The sorcerer had learned, and Daemon, tethered to his soul, learned with him. In the final vision, there was no struggle. There was only a stillness so absolute it felt like the center of a void. The sorcerer did not reach for the candle, he built it. Within the architecture of his own mind, he constructed a second cylinder of glass flawless, unmoving, and absolute. He did not imagine it, he rendered it into existence until every angle was a perfect reflection of the physical object before him. The man inhaled, and the world narrowed. Then, the internal candle ignited. A thin, cold green flame bloomed behind the sorcerer's retinas. It did not surge, it aligned. Only then did the real obsidian answer. A whisper of emerald light stirred in the heart of the glass, and for a heartbeat, distance ceased to matter. The tower did not vanish, but it became irrelevant. Sound arrived first with a distant, melodic voice from a land the sorcerer had never seen. Then came emotion, a sharp, foreign spike of fear that belonged to someone else. Finally, a room took form, fragile as breath on glass. The flame does not answer power, Daemon realized, the truth sinking into his marrow like frost. It answers alignment. For a moment, the clarity was perfect. Then, a fracture appeared not in the vision, but in the sorcerer's mind. A single ripple of doubt, a flicker of human strain, and the internal flame wavered. The connection snapped. The distant chamber shattered into fragments of light, and a suffocating panic surged upward. It wasn't the failure that terrified the mage, it was the vertiginous realization of how vast the world was, and how small his hold had been. Daemon's eyes snapped open in the dim light of Maegor's Holdfast. The pale morning filtered through the silk hangings of his bed, but the echo of the green flame remained behind his eyes. He lay perfectly still, his small body heavy with the residue of a dead man's frustration. A servant approached quietly, her face a mask of maternal softness, but Daemon turned his face away before she could meet his gaze. It was a reflex of containment. He felt the memory settling deeper into his soul, not as a lesson learned, but as a weight inherited, complete with its scars. He reached it, Daemon whispered, his voice a tiny, chilling rasp against the silk sheets. And he lost it. The servant paused, blinking in the half-light. Did you say something, my prince? Silence was her only answer. Daemon's gaze drifted, unfocused and distant. He understood the flaw now. The sorcerer had forced the beginning and faltered at the end. He had tried to own the light instead of being the lens through which it traveled. His tiny fingers curled into the sheets, his mind already returning to the Library of Ash to dissect the wreckage of the sorcerer's mind. I will not inherit your failure, he thought, a cold, predatory light flickering in his violet eyes. I will refine it, hone it until every flaw is stripped bare and burned away. The flame deep within him did not yet burn, but it was no longer absent. It was a cold spark waiting for the right moment to turn the silence into a scream. System notification, memory integration, 100%. New concept unlocked, the internal mirror. The great sept of remembrance was a cavern of pale marble and cold echoes, its vaulted ceiling reaching toward the heavens like the ribcage of a stone giant. The morning air was thin, smelling of old incense and the damp chill of the Hill of Rainies. At the front of the sanctuary, beneath the towering statue of the mother, sat Queen Alysanne. She was the picture of royal grace, her silver hair caught in a simple net of pearls, her head bowed in a devotion that was as natural to her as breathing. Beside her sat the transformation. Sarah Targaryen was a vision of newfound modesty. The daring, low-cut silks of Lee were gone, replaced by a high-collared gown of dove-gray velvet, trimmed with white fox fur. She held a gilded copy of the seven-pointed star in her lap, her slender fingers tracing the illuminated script with a focus that borderlined on obsessive. The queen's aura was a steady, warm amber and a glow of genuine faith and maternal hope. She glanced at Sarah, and the amber flickered with a hopeful pink. She truly believed her wild daughter was finally coming home to the fold. Sarah's aura, however, was a lie. Beneath the dove-gray velvet, her essence was a seething, pressurized violet. The crimson streaks of her rebellion hadn't vanished, they had been forced into a tight, vibrating core. It wasn't the aura of a penitent, it was the aura of a prisoner measuring the thickness of the bars. Every time the Septon spoke of obedience, or the virtue of the silent maiden, the violet in Sarah's aura flared with a jagged, black spike of resentment. "You have been so diligent this week, Sarah," Alysanne whispered as the choir began the hymn to the crone. The queen reached out, patting Sarah's hand. "Your father is pleased. He sees the change in you." Sarah didn't look up from her book, but Daemon saw her jaw tighten. "I only wish to bring him honor, mother," Sarah replied. Her voice was a perfect imitation of Maegel's soft, melodic, and entirely hollow. "She is good. If I didn't have the tower, even I might believe her. She's playing for the great match now, using the queen's influence to wash away the stains of her past indiscretions. She wants a lord, a castle, and a wall between her and the starry sept." As the service ended and the bells of the sept began to toll, the queen stood to greet the high septon. For a brief moment, Sarah was left standing by the bench, her back to her mother. She looked down at Daemon. The mask slipped for a fraction of a second. Her amethyst eyes burned with a cold, desperate fire. She leaned down, ostensibly to straighten the collar of his tunic, her face inches from his. "Is it enough?" she whispered, her voice a jagged rasp that didn't match her gray velvet. "Does the king see? Or must I start bleeding for the seven as well?" Daemon looked at her, his violet eyes reflecting the emerald light he had seen in the library of ash. He didn't answer with words. He simply reached out and touched the gilded book in her lap, his small thumb resting on the word submission. Sarah recoiled as if he had bitten her. "Sarah, dear, are you coming?" the queen called, turning back with a smile. Sarah's mask snapped back into place instantly. "Of course, mother. I was just making sure little Daemon was comfortable." She followed the queen toward the exit, her posture perfect, her head bowed. But as she walked, Daemon saw her fingers white-knuckled against the spine of her holy book. The stage is set. She has convinced the queen, but Jaehaerys is a harder man to fool. He is already looking toward the great houses of the reach for her hand. I need to know which one he chooses, because a lord who can manage Sarah is a lord I cannot allow to rise. 3 comments 0 vote. Runes of the Freehold. The sky was endless. It was not the pale, distant ribbon of blue glimpsed from the arrow slits of the Red Keep, but a vast, predatory expanse that threatened to swallow the world whole. The wind did not merely blow, it screamed, a living thing that clawed at Daemon's silver hair and tugged at his silk tunics with freezing, insistent fingers. Beneath him, the Red Queen moved with the effortless dominance of a god. Melly's scarlet scales hummed with a deep, volcanic vibration, her rhythmic wingbeats carving through the air. At her neck, tucked securely against the firm warmth of Princess Alyssa, Daemon Targaryen watched the horizon. Trailing in their wake, straining against the buffeting slipstream, was Nyrax. She was no longer the fragile thing that had huddled in the shadows of his nursery. Now the size of a mountain pony, her lean body had undergone a grotesque, accelerated surge in growth since the opening of the Library of Ash. Her 10-foot wingspan beat with a frantic, unpolished power. Where Melis rode the sky, Nyrax fought it. Daemon's violet eyes tracked the younger dragon without turning his head. Too fast, he thought coldly. Her growth was not organic, it was refined by the tower. The fact that Nyrax could now spiritually enter the mental space of the second floor had fundamentally altered her biology. She was becoming an extension of his will. Cold, Alyssa's voice rang out, bright and defiant against the gale. She leaned forward, her arm a steady iron band around his waist. Her laughter was always there, just beneath the surface, fueled by the adrenaline of the heights. Daemon did not answer immediately. He watched the world blur into light. No, he said at last, his voice steady. It's quiet. Alyssa huffed a laugh, tilting her head. Quiet, with the wind trying to tear your ears off, little dragon. It is quieter than below, Daemon replied. The princess paused. For a fleeting second, she studied her son not as a babe, but as something difficult to name. Then, her wild grin returned. Well then, shall we go down before you freeze into a statue? Daemon's eyes flicked upward, higher. There was a pressure in the distance not seen, but felt. It was the same stillness he had encountered in the library of Ash. No, mother, let us go higher. For a heartbeat, Alyssa hesitated. Then, she threw her head back and laughed a sound of pure, unrestrained delight. That's my son. Up, Melis. The Red Queen answered with a roar that shook Daemon's very marrow. She angled skyward, the climb steepening until the warmth of the world fell away. The air grew thin and biting, tasting of frost and ozone. Below them, the clouds merged into a rolling, white sea, isolating them in a kingdom of gold and blue. Nyrax struggled, her wings beat in desperate bursts, her young muscles screaming as she refused to fall behind. Daemon watched her with the clinical assessment of a master. She adapts. Good. As they leveled out at the zenith, the air grew eerily still. The rhythm of Melis' wings felt muffled, as if filtered through water. Daemon's breath slowed, synchronizing with the tower behind his eyes. Suddenly, the sky shifted. Not in color, but in weight. There it is, Daemon realized. The same stillness. A presence. Watching. Look, Alyssa shouted, gesturing toward the sun breaking across the cloudscape in blinding gold. Tell me that's not worth the climb. The pressure vanished. The sky returned to being just sky. In that moment of sudden release, Daemon did not calculate. He did not think. He shouted a raw, unrestrained sound of pure exhilaration that was ripped from his small lungs. For one heartbeat, he was only a child. But the moment passed. The memories of his past life, the engineering, the history, the 9-to-5 exhaustion returned to anchor him. He remembered the hatred he felt when he first woke in this infant body, the prison of flesh, the inability to speak, the sheer powerlessness. Now, looking at the clouds beneath his feet, that hatred had refined into something sharper. This world of fire and blood was no longer foreign. It was his. Enjoying yourself? Alyssa asked warmly. Yes, Daemon said. He paused, his gaze hardening. I think I will enjoy it more. The red keep rose from the clouds like a memory made of stone. As Melis spiraled downward in a controlled descent, the figures in the courtyard became clear. At the center stood Queen Alysanne, regal and composed, holding the Princess Gale. Beside her stood Rhaenys, her gaze already fixed skyward with a hunger that matched the dragons, and Viserys, watching with wide-eyed curiosity. Melis landed with a thunderous impact, her scarlet wings folding with a snap like a closing book. Alyssa swung down, lifting Daemon with her. Nyrax followed seconds later, her landing less graceful, her claws scraping the stone with an irritated huff. Did you touch the sun, mother? Viserys asked, his voice small, hushed as if he were speaking in a sept. He reached out a hesitant hand toward Melis' scarlet flank, but pulled it back before making contact. It looked like you were flying into the gold. Alyssa laughed, the wind still in her lungs. She swung down from the saddle, tucking Daemon under one arm while ruffling Viserys' silver-gold hair with her free hand. Not quite the sun, little sprout, but high enough to see the world curve. You'll have your turn soon enough. Viserys looked at Daemon, then at the growing silver form of Nyrax, who was currently snapping irritably at a dragonkeeper's hook. Daemon is so small, Viserys whispered, his brow furrowed in confusion. Why does he get to go first? Because he doesn't scream when the wind bites, Alyssa said with a wink. Daemon remained silent, his gaze shifting to Rhaenys. She stood apart from the boys, her violet eyes fixed on Melis with a hunger so profound it was almost painful to witness through. Or a reading. Her essence was a swirling storm of indigo longing, ambition, and a preemptive sense of loss. In the original timeline, Alyssa would die soon. Melis would pass to Rhaenys. The path to the dance would be paved with those deaths. Daemon watched her for a moment longer. Then, inwardly, he whispered to the ghost of the future, "Sorry, cousin. Not this time." A hush fell over the courtyard as King Jaehaerys arrived, standing tall and silent beside the queen. He wasn't smiling. His violet eyes weren't on the triumphant Alyssa, they were fixed on the silver-scaled beast crouching at Daemon's feet. "She is growing too fast, Balon," the king said, his voice a low resonance that cut through the chatter of Viserys and Rhaenys. Balon the Brave stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of Blackfire. She is healthy, father. Stronger than any hatchling I've seen. She is a risk, Jaehaerys countered. He looked at Daemon a long, searching gaze that tried to pierce the toddler's mask. A dragon of that size cannot be kept in a prince's chambers. Not even a Targaryen's. He gestured to the dragonkeepers standing in the shadows of the archway, their blackened scale armor gleaming like oil. Under my order, Nyrax is to be transferred to the dragon pit. Tonight, secretly. Daemon felt a spike of cold fury in his chest, but he kept his face as still as a winter pond. He looked at Nyrax. Through their draconic resonance, he felt her confusion, a jagged, lonely fear of being separated from the nest. He wants to train her, Daemon thought. The transfer happened when the moon was a sliver of bone over the Blackwater. A heavy carriage, draped in thick black velvet to muffle any sound and hide any glow, waited at the postern gate. Daemon stood in the shadows, watched closely by Esser Ryam Redwyn. He wasn't allowed to touch her, only to watch as the dragonkeepers led the silver dragon into the dark maw of the transport. Nyrax didn't roar, she didn't fight, she turned her head back once, her slitted yellow eyes finding Daemon's in the dark. Patience, Daemon sent through the bond, a focused pulse of calm and iron. The pit is not a prison. It is a forge. Siphon the heat. Grow. I will come for you in the dark. As the carriage rattled away toward the Hill of Rainies, Jaehaerys appeared beside his grandson. The old king smelled of old parchment and beeswax. It is for the best, Daemon, the king said softly. A dragon needs the deep heat of the earth to truly anchor its soul. And you need to focus on your lessons here. That night, Daemon did not sleep. He sat cross-legged on his bed and closed his eyes, descending instantly into the magic tower. He didn't stop at the shelves. He went to the very edge of the second floor, where the gray ash fell into a bottomless abyss. He reached out with his mind, searching for the silver spark of Nyrax. Link established. Resonance distance bypass. He felt her. She was deep in the lower pens of the dragon pit, surrounded by the heavy, ancient presence of Balerion and Vagar. She was afraid, but as Daemon's consciousness touched hers, she settled. The tower acted as a bridge. Distance was irrelevant to the ash. Eat, Daemon commanded, showing her a memory from the library, a Valyrian technique for absorbing the ambient mana of older dragons. The Red Queen and the Black Dread are your banquet. Take their fire, make it yours. In the dark of the dragon pit, the silver dragon opened her mouth and exhaled a thin, crystalline mist of mana. She wasn't just growing anymore. She was evolving. System notification. New passive skill. Distance siphoning. Description. Through the tower, Nyrax can continue to grow using the user's mana, regardless of physical separation. Current growth rate. 1.5x accelerated by dragon pit environment. The second floor felt different tonight. The gray flakes fell more heavily, swirling around the edges of the abyss where his connection to Nyrax pulsed like a silver wire. Daemon ignored the familiar shelves of engineering and history. He needed something older, something that predated the decline of the Valyrian Freehold. He moved toward a section of the library that had previously been shrouded in a thick, sulphurous mist. As he approached, a faint, rhythmic pulsing caught his eye. At the end of a row of obsidian-carved shelves, a single book was vibrating G. This was a sharp, piercing cerulean light, cold as a glacier and just as ancient. Daemon reached out, his small hand looking ghost-like against the blue radiance. As his fingers brushed the spine, a system notification flared in his mind, but he brushed it aside. He pulled the book from the shelf. The cover was bound in a material harder than dragonbone, blue Valyrian steel, etched with interlocking geometric patterns that moved when he blinked. Daemon opened the book. Instead of charcoal or ink, the pages were inscribed with living runes. They didn't just sit on the parchment, they drifted and realigned themselves to match his intent. This wasn't a book of spells. It was a manual for metaphysical engineering. The text described how the ancient Valyrians didn't just forge steel, they sang it into existence using these fundamental symbols. The rune of Aegis prevents the oxidation of metal. Even after 1,000 years in the salt air of Dragonstone, a blade marked with this would never show a speck of rust. The rune of Vorpal aligns the atoms of the edge into a single, molecular line. It doesn't just sharpen the blade, it ensures the edge never dulls, capable of shearing through plate armor like wet silk. The rune of Kinetic Anchor increases the structural density without adding weight. A sword becomes unbreakable, vibrating with a low frequency that shatters ordinary steel upon impact. Daemon's eyes scanned the complex diagrams of soul binding. The book explained that the reason modern Targaryens couldn't recreate Valyrian steel wasn't just a lost recipe for dragonfire, it was because they had forgotten the language of the world. To create a true artifact, one had to staple these runes onto the physical matter using a specific frequency of mana. Matter is a cage, runes are the key. He who speaks to the metal shall rule the men who only wield it. This realization shifted Daemon's entire perspective. Dragons were the ultimate deterrent, the nuclear weapons of the Targaryen arsenal. They were symbols of absolute power, but they were too destructive, too rare, and too valuable to be used for every border dispute or rebellious lordling. You didn't burn a village to catch a single thief, you didn't glass a city just to collect taxes. But a legion armed with runic gear, an army whose shields could not be broken, whose spears never dulled. That was how you built an empire that lasted 10,000 years. System notification. New profession unlocked. Runic Architect Rank 1. Acquired Blueprint. The Basic Sharpening Array. Current progress. 0/10 runes mastered. Daemon looked at his small, soft hands. He couldn't forge a sword yet, his body was too weak to strike an anvil. But he could etch, he could practice these symbols on the small trinkets in his nursery. 2 comments 0 vote. The flame that answered back. In hidden chamber, Daemon room. The air in the hidden chamber was stale, a vacuum of sensory input that tasted of cold iron and dormant power. At its center stood the glass candle, a 3-foot pillar of obsidian that seemed to drink the very shadows around it. As Daemon looked into its depthless surface, the memory of his audience with the old king returned. Jaehaerys had been a silhouette against the high windows of the small council chamber, his silver-gold hair transformed into a halo by the dying sun. He hadn't turned when Daemon entered. He rarely did anymore. He simply watched the city he had spent a lifetime building, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. You spoke before of lighting it, the king said, his voice a low resonance that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. Do you still believe you can? Daemon stood small and still in the center of the rug. Yes. A pause, measured, heavy with the history of men who had gone mad staring into the black glass. And if you fail? Jaehaerys asked, finally turning. His violet eyes weren't those of a grandfather, they were the eyes of a judge. Then I will learn why, Daemon replied. The king's gaze narrowed. Glass candles are not toys, Daemon. They are anchors to a world we were meant to leave behind. Men greater than you archmaesters, maester, have tried to coax a spark from the obsidian and found nothing but a silence that eventually swallowed them whole. I am not asking to succeed, Daemon said, his voice steady, devoid of a child's desperation. That made the king's posture shift. The judge was replaced by a scholar, intrigued despite himself. Explain. I am asking to practice, Daemon said. I am asking to observe the resistance of the stone. A longer silence followed, one that felt like a physical weight in the room. Jaehaerys studied him not as a grandson, but as a structural problem. He saw the stillness in the boy's hands, the lack of fidgeting, the terrifyingly adult focus in his eyes. What you ask is not harmless, the king said quietly. There are things in old Valyria that were buried for a reason. Secrets that act like a poison once they are tasted. Then I will not dig blindly, Daemon answered. It was a lie, they both felt the shape of it. But it was a controlled lie, a social contract that allowed the king to grant permission without admitting he was curious to see if the boy could actually do it. Jaehaerys exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders. You will inform me of any change, any flicker, any heat, any shadow that moves within the glass. I will, and you will not attempt to light it through force, the king added, his voice hardening into a command. You will not spill blood on the stone, nor will you call upon the fire of your dragon. If it does not wake for your mind, it does not wake at all. Daemon inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect for the law of the structure. I will not force it. That, at least, was the absolute truth. To force a glass candle was to invite a backlash that could shatter the mind. It will be placed in your chambers, Jaehaerys said, turning back to the window. Having learned from the sorcerer's mistake, he began. A ripple moved across the surface of the candle, turning the solid glass into something that resembled dark, disturbed water. Then, with a sound like a distant bell struck underwater, the wickless tip ignited. A needle of white flame, pale as a ghost shroud and cold as a winter star, pierced the darkness. It did not flicker. It did not cast a shadow. It revealed. As the flame steadied, Daemon's mind was jerked violently from his tether. He felt his 3-year-old body slump against the floor, but his spirit was already a league away, then 10, then 100. He was no longer a child in a cellar, he was a pulse of intent riding the unseen veins of the world. He tore through the clouds, over the jagged, snow-clutching teeth of the moon mountains, driven by a singular, burning thought, the veil. The transition ended not with a landing, but with a synchronization. One moment, he was in the suffocating silence of the keep, the next, he was standing, a shadow of thought in a solar draped in sky-blue silks. The air tasted of frost and high-altitude lavender. Before him sat Daemon Targaryen, her silver hair a waterfall of moonlight as she cradled the infant Emma. She was singing a lullaby, her voice a fragile defense against the howling winds of the Eyrie. Daemon watched her, a cold, ancient grief stirring in his chest. In the histories he carried like a burden, this woman was a bird broken by a golden cage. He did not mean to interfere. He meant only to observe. But the tower behind his eyes pulsed. The white flame back in the red keep flared into a jagged, angry violet. The bridge between them became a two-way door. Ant. The word did not travel through the air. It vibrated in the very marrow of her bones. Daemon stilled. The lullaby died in her throat. She did not scream, she turned with the slow, agonizing grace of the terrified. Her violet eyes, wet and wide, searched the empty air where Daemon's ghost hung like a shimmering heat haze. "Daemon," she whispered, her voice a thread about to snap. "Is that you?" The candle was cold again. The room was silent, but the silence had been changed forever. The connection did not break with a roar, but with a hollow, silver fading. As the distance to the veil stretched and the bridge to Daela's solar solidified, the cost of the alignment began to outpace the shallow reserves of Daemon's 3-year-old body. The white needle of flame didn't shriek or explode. Instead, it shivered once, the violet hue deepening until the light simply collapsed inward, as if the obsidian had finished its meal. Daemon felt his consciousness slide back into his physical form, not with the violence of a fall, but with the heavy, leaden weight of sudden exhaustion. His eyes opened in the dark of the hidden chamber. There was no blood, no ringing in his ears, only the profound, bone-deep tiredness of a traveler who had walked 1,000 miles in a single heartbeat. He remained still for a moment, his small hand resting on the cold stone floor. The candle was once again a silent pillar of shadow, indifferent and dark. He had reached the limit of his current vessel, but the objective had been achieved. But he did not succumb to the fatigue. In the instant the connection to Daela had severed, in that microsecond between the fading of the white flame and the return to his flesh, he had felt it. It was a presence that existed outside the walls of the Red Keep. It felt vast, ancient, and chillingly attentive. It was a gaze that didn't look at him, but through him, as if his very existence were a window into a room. He forced his trembling limbs to move, pushing himself up until he sat cross-legged before the obsidian pillar. The experiment had been a success, but the parameters of the tool were far more demanding than he had initially thought. He reached 3 primary conclusions. First was distance was not a barrier to sight, only to stability. He had crossed the moon mountains in a heartbeat. The glass candle was a functional satellite, provided the user mana held. He could watch the world which is connected to much larger, invisible network. Second was he was not alone in the dark. That presence, the vast, ancient weight that had brushed against his consciousness, was proof. Others were using these network of the world. To look out was to leave a door cracked open for others to look in. If he wanted to spy on the great houses, he would have to develop shade casting, a way to mask his mana signature. Third was only a whisper was all he could manage. To project a voice across the 7 kingdoms required a surge of mana his 2-year-old core simply couldn't sustain yet. If he wanted to influence events directly, to speak to the king in his sleep or command a dragonkeeper from afar, he needed to accelerate his growth. He stood up, his legs steadying. The exhaustion was still there, but it had shifted into a dull ache. He needed to return to his chambers before the morning watch changed. Hours later, the great dining hall of the Red Keep was an oppressive symphony of clashing silver and hushed, high-stakes conversation. Torches flickered in their iron sconces, casting dancing shadows against the tapestries of Aegon's conquest. At the long trestle table, the royal family was gathered in full, a rare and tense occurrence. King Jaehaerys sat at the head, his expression unreadable as he looked over a tray of opened scrolls, each bearing the wax seal of a great house. Queen Alysanne sat beside him, her amber aura radiating a soft, anxious hope, while Sarah sat across from them, her grey velvet gown a shield of newfound modesty. In the midst of the talk of alliances and dowries, Daemon was a whirlwind of sensory focus. The glass candle had taken its toll. Every cell in his 3-year-old body was screaming for food to replace the energy he had burned. In his left hand, he gripped a roasted chicken leg, the skin glistening with fat, in his right, a cracked crab leg dripping with butter. To others, it looked like the messy appetite of a growing boy. To him, it was a necessity to sustain the relentless demands of his body and power. "Slow down, little gargoyle," Valyria whispered, leaning in beside him. Her perfume, usually cloying, was lost beneath the scent of the roasted meats. She reached out with a silk napkin, dabbing at a stray drop of grease on his chin. "Eat slowly. The food isn't going to sprout wings and fly back to the kitchens." Daemon didn't stop. He tore a strip of meat from the bone with a focus that was borderline feral. "Lord Rowan has increased his offer," Jaehaerys said, his voice cutting through the clatter of plates. "He tapped a seal of a golden tree. He offers a significant land grant along the Mander if the match is made. It would solidify the reach for a generation." "And the Starks?" Alysanne asked softly, her gaze drifting to Sarah. The Raven from Winterfell spoke of a different kind of alliance. "Lord Ellard seeks a princess who can endure the coming winter. He offers no gold, but a loyalty that the South has forgotten." Sarah's hand tightened around her silver goblet until her knuckles turned as white as the snowfall she feared. "The Rowans are wealthy," Balon added, tearing into a thick hunk of crusty bread. "But the North is distant. Perhaps distance is what Sarah needs to find her goodness, far from the temptations of the street." "There is also Aldtown," Jaehaerys continued, sliding a heavy scroll across the wood. The seal was the beacon of the Hightower, pressed in gray and gold wax. "Lord Ormond Hightower is persistent. He suggests that a union between the dragon and the tower would settle the whispers of the faith once and for all. He promises a life of unparalleled prestige, provided she remains devout." Across the table, Sarah's mask of piety flickered. Aldtown meant the Starry Sept. It meant living in the shadow of the High Septon, a gilded cage where every breath would be measured by a priest. "And the Redwinds," Alysanne noted, pointing to a seal of grapes. "They offer the arbor, sun, wine, and the finest fleet in the Sunset Sea. They are eager, though perhaps too eager for the prestige of a royal match." "Rowan is a cage of silk," Daemon thought, swallowing a mouthful of crab. "Hightower is a cage of stone and incense. But Stark. North was the land of the old gods, the weirwoods, and the things that watched from the dark. If Sarah went north, she would be his eyes where the roots ran deep." "What do you think, Sarah?" the king asked, his eyes narrowing as he watched his daughter's controlled breathing. "The gold of Goldengrove, the prayers of Aldtown, or the iron of Winterfell?" Sarah looked up. Her face was a marble mask, but her aura was a seething, pressurized violet. "I only wish to serve the house, father. Wherever you think my virtues are best put to use." Daemon dropped the bone and reached for a bowl of honeyed plums. He didn't speak. He simply let his gaze linger on the Stark seal, sending a tiny, focused pulse of cold and stillness toward the king's hand. Jaehaerys frowned, his fingers hesitating over the gray wax of the wolf. "The North is a hard land," the king mused. "But perhaps it is the only land hard enough to temper a Targaryen." To be continued.